I've always compared it to walking through a cemetery. You can sense and sometimes visualize the ghosts of the crew who lived on board and died without anyone to record their passing. The currents, the gloomy visibility, the silence broken only by the hiss of your air regulator, all add to the eeriness. When I ask most fiction writers what interest they have besides writing, they look at me like my head is lopsided. Their lives are entwined around what comes out of their word processors. Feeding my readers adventure tales based around a devil-may-care character by the name of Dirk Pitt is only one chapter of my existence. I'm addicted to the challenge of the search. Whether it's for lost shipwrecks, airplanes, steam locomotives, or people. There is a piece of me in Dirk Pitt and a slice of him in me. We're both about 6'3". His eyes are greener than mine, and he certainly enthralls the ladies more than I ever did. We have the same taste for adventure, although his escapades are far more extreme than mine. I never raised the Titanic, for example, nor have I saved the life of the president, or found a great hoard of Inca gold at the end of an underground river. I have, however, attempted some crazy things, besides tramping through humid backcountry looking for old cannons, or being tossed around in a small boat during a Force 8 storm while searching for a sunken submarine. Like riding a bicycle over the Rocky Mountains and through the deserts to California when I turned 50, taking the stick of a glider at 55, and bungee jumping at 60. I'm thinking of skydiving on my 65th. How did this attempt to mirror fantasy with life begin? Perhaps you remember me. I was the kid in your high school algebra class who stared out the window while the teacher lectured describing ship-to-ship battles that included the ironclads of the Civil War. I did all the crazy things kids did in the leisurely days before television, like riding my bicycle down a hill and off a small cliff into the tree branches below, or building a makeshift raft and sailing down a rushing stream during a rainstorm. Amazingly, I never broke a bone until I passed the age of 50. I learned early that adventure can come cheap. In college, I had a close friend named Felix Dupuis. One summer, we loaded up his 1939 Ford convertible and set out on a drive around the country. In 3 months, we covered over 13,000 miles and 36 states. We slept in bandstands in Vermont, railroad boxcars in Texas, and in the bushes beside the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. The entire trip only cost me $350. We returned home just in time to enlist in the Air Force after the outbreak of the police action in Korea, more out of boredom with school than with any great patriotic fervor. Despite my applying for aerial photography or the intelligence department, some sneaky sergeant in the training command found out I was a California hot rodder and sent me to aircraft engine school. After graduation, the Air Force demanded I be attached to Hickam Field, Hawaii, to work on mammoth 28-cylinder radial engines mounted on C-97 Boeing Stratocruisers. These were large propeller-driven aircraft the Air Force used as transports to fly critical personnel and supplies to Korea before airlifting the wounded back to hospitals in the States. During the 3 years I was stationed on Oahu, my buddies Dave Anderson and Al Giordano explored with me the inner jungles of the island, searching for lost aircraft, ancient Hawaiian burial caves, and missing people. I recall finding none. Al Giordano was a gritty and witty Italian who was the model for Al Giordino in my books. We also became great diving fanatics. We hit the water every chance we had, exploring the bays and coves around Oahu. This was in late 1951, and there was little in the way of underwater equipment. On returning to civilian life, I tried college again, but found that nothing had changed. The same musty classroom smell still nauseated me. Drawn back to the smell of oil and gasoline, my old school buddy Dick Klein and I bought a gas station, which we operated for almost 4 years just off the San Bernardino Freeway, 6 miles outside of Los Angeles. I finally became a certified diver after quitting a highfalutin advertising job in Hollywood to a small chain of dive shops in Orange County. There was a method to my madness because I had decided to write sea stories. And what better place to launch my career as a writer than from behind the counter of a dive shop? When business slowed in mid-afternoon, I sat at a card table in the back of the store and on a portable typewriter wrote a book called The Mediterranean Caper. After making up my mind that I had at last found my niche in life and signing with a New York literary agent, I sadly left the dive shops to pursue my new career as a writer. Suddenly, and quite unexpectedly, with the success of Raise the Titanic, I now had the time and funds to search for lost shipwrecks. In December of 1977, I read in one of the books written by Peter Throckmorton, Dean of American Marine Archaeology, that a gentleman in England, Sidney Wignall, was following up leads to John Paul Jones's famous revolutionary ship, the Bonhomme Richard, which sank after an epic battle off Flamborough Head in the North Sea. My British publishers tracked down Wignall, and I called him. A peppery Welshman, he assumed that I was some kind of deranged con man when I offered out of the blue to fund an expedition to locate the Richard. Sidney had previously discovered a Spanish Armada galleon and searched for Sir Francis Drake's lead coffin off Portobello in Panama. He was a top-notch historian, but organizational capabilities were an enigma to him. The expedition veered 2 degrees beyond a fiasco. Tons of unnecessary equipment, including a decompression chamber, were loaded aboard an old World War II British minesweeper used for geological surveying as the Shagnasty Barn Door and Oil Company. The Flying Dutchman sailed in a better ship than this one. The boat was called the Celtic Lord. Celtic, with a K. And there was one crewman who, for some inexplicable reason, has never left my mind. His name was Gonzo. I remember the name because it was tattooed on his forehead. Anyway, everyone assembled in Bridlington, England, a blue-collar Las Vegas, during August of 1978. Several divers from the University of Wales showed up to participate. My son-in-law and daughter, Bob and Terry Toft, had also arrived early to work with Sidney Wignall, assembling the gear and gluing together an old boat that was to be used to ferry the search team and supplies between the Celtic Lord and shore. And among others, my wife Barbara, younger daughter Dana, and son Dirk also joined the expedition. I found it comforting to have friendly shoulders to cry on as the project began to unravel. The opening day of the search didn't get underway until almost 11 o'clock in the morning. The sea was fairly rough, and the boat ride from the dock to the Celtic Lord was an adventure in itself. When we came alongside, Gonzo and another crew member helped everyone climb aboard the ship but me. Struggling over the railing with my load, I reached the galley soaked through to my undershorts. No one gave me so much as a glance. Sid Wignall acted as though I didn't exist. It was then I introduced my hand routine that became beneficial over the years in dealing with mutinous boat crews and dive teams. I raised my right hand into the air and inquired in a loud voice, "Does everyone see this hand?" They all stared indifferently and nodded silently. Whatever happens, I continued, a fire aboard ship, we strike an iceberg, or we're torpedoed by the crew of a U-boat who forgot to surrender, you save this hand. Good old Gonzo sailed into the net. Why should we bust our arse to save that hand, mate? I had the power. The force was mine. I looked him square in the eye and said, because this is the hand that writes the checks. It was amazing how I went from Rodney Dangerfield to Arnold Schwarzenegger in the space of 30 seconds. Now I was the first one helped on board the ship. Gonzo became my pal and always kept my coffee cup full. Even the captain began calling me sir. I knew then that searching for shipwrecks was in my blood. The wreck we eventually found, which Sidney thought might be the Bonhomme Richard, turned out to be a cargo ship sunk by a German U-boat during World War I. And so the curtain came down on my introduction to the intrigue and adventure of hunting the ship. Other expedition for the following year. Wayne Grunquist, Austin, Texas attorney and eventual president of NUMA, suggested that for tax purposes we should incorporate as a nonprofit foundation. And so NUMA was born, the National Underwater and Marine Agency. To embark on a search for a lost shipwreck, an Indian mound, gold bars, silver coins, or porcelain chamber pots, you don't need the backing of the government or a university. You don't need a truckload of expensive equipment. The only instrument generally used to locate a hidden object entombed under salt water and sediment is a magnetometer. If the side-scan sonar is the right arm of any shipwreck search, the magnetometer is the left. The two metal detectors used most frequently for finding and measuring the magnetic intensity of a buried iron object are the proton mag and a gradiometer. Both basically do the same thing, but use different systems of measurement. Research is the key. You can never do enough research. Without a ballpark within reasonable boundaries to look, you'll be wasting time and money on an effort with the same probability of success as finding the Pied Piper of Hamelin and the town's kids on Mars. Research can either lower the odds or tell you it's hopeless. Many's the wreck project I filed away without making the slightest attempt to explore because the data showed that it was a lost cause. Many people think looking for a lost ship is exciting and adventurous. The truth is, the actual search is the living embodiment of tedium. You are thrown hither and yon in a small boat by waves from dawn to dusk, sweating your pores out in a humid climate while fighting to keep from becoming seasick as you stare at little lines squiggling across graph paper. Still, when an image appears on the sonar recording, or the marker sweeps across the aluminized paper of the magnetometer, and you know you've got an anomaly, or a target that matches the signature you're after, the anticipation becomes overwhelming. Then, when the divers surface and report that they've identified the object of your search, the blood, sweat, tears, and expense are forgotten. You're swept by a wave of triumph that beats sex any day of the month. Well, almost. Because our expeditions are usually funded by my book royalties without any type of donations or grants, my wife, an accountant, because I indulge in all this madness for no profit or gain. This is actually the first time in nearly 20 years I've told about my experiences. What follows are the chronicles of lost shipwrecks and a lost locomotive. The people who are portrayed past and present were and are real, though the historical events are dramatized to give you a more focused insight into the action.
The steamboat Lexington, Monday, January 13th, 1840. Stepping from the two-wheeled hansom cab, a tall, bearded man shivered from the bitter cold and buried his chin beneath the collar of his coat. He set his carpet bag on the icy sidewalk, reached up and handed the fare to the cabbie, who sat elevated behind the carriage. The man paused to glance at his pocket watch. The Roman numerals on the gold timepiece told him it was 2 minutes past 3 o'clock p.m. Reassuring himself that his ticket was firmly in the breast pocket of his coat, he hurried through the terminal to the pier on the other side. The bearded man had booked passage on the steamboat Lexington, bound from New York for Stonington, Connecticut, the terminus where passengers transferred onto the railroad to continue their journey to Boston. He was Smith Professor of Modern Languages at Harvard, and after giving 3 lectures and selling his latest poem, he was returning home. Seeing black smoke surge through the steamboat's tall forward stack, he began running madly across the wooden planks of the pier, forcing his way through a wave of passengers who had disembarked from the steamboat Richmond. Apprehension mounted and quickly turned to frustration. Too late. He had missed his boat. Only a few feet separated the hull from the dock. Frigid water, and he quickly changed his mind. The captain was standing in the open door of the wheelhouse, staring at the late arrival. He smiled and shrugged. Once a boat cast off and left the dock, no captain ever turned back for tardy passengers. He threw the disappointed ticket holder a brief wave, stepped into the wheelhouse and closed the door, happy to return to the warmth of the pot-bellied stove beside the big steering helm. The man on the pier stood there panting, his normally white face turned crimson. He stomped on the planking of the pier to shake the crust of ice from his feet as he watched Long Island Sound's fastest steamer slip into the East River, her side paddle wheels churning the gray-green water. He failed to notice a dock worker who moved beside him, puffing on a pipe. The stranger nodded at the departing boat. "She leave without you?" he asked. "If I'd arrived 10 seconds earlier, I could have jumped aboard. There's ice forming on the Sound. Miserable night to be making a passage." The man gripped the carpet bag under one arm and shoved his gloved hands deep in the pockets of his long coat. "Curse the luck. Another night in the city's the last thing I wanted." He took one last look at the steamer making its way upriver through the cold, forbidding water, then turned and walked back to the terminal, unaware that those few feet between the dock and the hull of the departing boat had spared him an ugly and violent death. "I'd have sworn that crazy fool was going to jump for it," said Captain George Child. He spoke to the pilot of the Lexington, Captain Stephen Manchester. Manchester turned to Child without taking his hands from the helm. "Mystery to me why passengers wait until the last minute to board." Child stepped to the front of the wheelhouse and peered at a thermometer that was mounted on the exterior window frame. "Barely 4 degrees above zero. She'll hit a good 5 degrees below before this night is over." Manchester nodded. "We'll see ice before we dock in Stonington." Child pulled a cigar from his coat pocket and lit it. "The old Lex is the strongest boat on the Sound. She'll see us through." A veteran ship's officer with 4 years' experience in steamboats traveling Long Island Sound, Child routinely served as master of Mohegan, another of the passenger line steamers. But this night he was substituting for the boat's regular master, Captain Jacob Vanderbilt, the brother of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was in the early cargo. The space beneath the promenade deck was packed with nearly 150 bales of cotton, some piled within a foot of the smokestack casing. For some strange reason, Child failed to be concerned about the heavy concentration of inflammable cotton stacked so close to the casing, that had caught fire only a few days before. The rest of the cargo, in wooden crates, was stowed around the shields surrounding the engine. Satisfied the cargo was tied down properly, he stepped to a hatch and dropped down the ladder into the center section of the boat where the engine and boilers were mounted. The Lexington had one of the most efficient steam engines of her day, built by the West Point foundry. This was a vertical beam engine, commonly called a walking beam, activated by a 48-inch diameter steam cylinder with an 11-foot stroke. When a full head of steam approached the red line on her pressure gauges, she cut the water at close to 25 miles an hour, faster than most Confederate blockade runners 2 decades later. The boat's chief engineer was examining the quivering needles on the dials of his brass steam gauges when Child tapped him on the shoulder. "Soon as we pass Sands Point, pour on the coal. I want a fast run." The engineer paused to spit a stream of tobacco juice into the bilge. "Through by daylight. That's our motto, Captain." Child enjoyed the warmth near the boilers for a minute or two longer, before climbing back up the ladder and making his way to the captain's cabin to wash up for dinner with the passengers. Manchester turned the wheel over to his helmsman. He wiped the glass which had begun to mist from the inside and peered at the beacon on King's Point. 3 degrees to port, he said. Manchester picked up a shoreline. There was no apprehension as he stared over the blackening water. Now that they were in the open sound, the trickiest part of the voyage was over, and he began to breathe a little easier. He felt safe on the Lexington. She was a stout boat, fast and ruggedly built for heavy weather. Her keel had been laid by the shipyard of Bishop and Simonson of New York on a warm Monday in September of 1834. Unlike later steamboats that were designed by men who drafted detailed plans, a wooden model of the hull was carved and altered to the whims of Commodore Vanderbilt until he was pleased with the results. Then, using a model as a guide, full-size outlines were drawn in chalk. Next, carpenters, exacting craftsmen of their time, cut and joined her timbered framework. Later renowned as a man who revered Ebenezer Scrooge, Cornelius Vanderbilt stepped out of character and went overboard in making the Lexington the finest passenger vessel of the era. He lavished a considerable fortune on ornate teak deck railings, cabin doors, staircases, and interior paneling. A fancy lounge and dining salon comprised the main cabin. As Captain Child stepped into the main cabin 15 minutes before the call to dinner was announced, he looked over the passengers. Without checking the boarding list, Child guessed there were approximately 115 passengers who had paid the $1 fare, meals extra. Deck passage was 50 cents, but there were no takers tonight. Counting his crew of 34, there were almost 150 men, women, and children on board the Lexington for the run to Stonington. Several card players were seated at the tables, quietly engrossed in their game. 2 well-known Boston comedy actors, Charles Eberly and Henry J. Finn, kept the conversation lively as the cards were dealt. Peter McKenna, a businessman from New York, won the first pot. Mothers and fathers gathered on the sofas and entertained their young children with stories and with toys purchased in the city. A party of merchants stood around the stoves discussing business and debating politics. The lounge was heavily attended this trip by sea captains who had made port after months at sea and were traveling to their own firesides and their cherished loved ones. They took turns swapping sea tales with each other. A notable passenger was Adolphus Harnden of Harnden's Express, who was transporting $20,000 in silver coin and $50,000 in banknotes for the Merchants' Bank. Dinner was served at 6 p.m., and passengers were served a choice between mutton with boiled tomatoes and baked flounder in a wine sauce with rice. Shortly Shortly after 7:30, the first mate, Edwin Ferber, came to the wheelhouse door and alerted Captain Manchester. "We've a fire on board. Set a course to the nearest land." "I'm bringing her about now, sir, but the wheel is not answering the helm." Together, the two captains and the steersman gripped the spokes and applied their strength in an effort to steer the boat toward safety 4 miles and 20 minutes away. Suddenly, the wheel spun out of their hands. Child looked grimly at the others. The fire must have burned through the port steering rope, below the wheelhouse. Now, out of control, with the engine still turning, the Lexington began helplessly running in wide circles. Child leaned out the door and gazed toward the stern. The beautiful boat was vomiting fire and smoke from her entire midsection. Leaving Captain Child and the steersman, Manchester ran out. Second Mate David Crowley rushed to the center of the boat and found flames leaping from several bales of cotton. He organized the deckhands and the dining salon waiters into a bucket brigade and began throwing water on the growing holocaust. Short on buckets, they spilled the merchants' bank's silver coins from their wooden crates onto the deck and hurriedly began filling the boxes with water and passing them on to the men nearest the flames. Their efforts made no headway. The flames spread with incredible speed and soon overwhelmed the firefighters. They retreated to the paddle wheel guards. Too late to make their escape, the crew on the forecastle deck were trapped by a wall of fire reaching up to the top of the smokestack. Second Mate Crowley stood by Captain Child and asked, "Sir, what is to be done?" Child looked around at the fear etched on the passengers' faces. "Gentlemen, take to the boats." Then he walked aft to direct the launching of the lifeboats. Utter confusion and terror swept the passengers. They made a frantic rush for the lifeboats and brushed aside the crew who were attempting to ready them for launching. Caught up in mindless panic, the passengers flooded into the boats and stupidly lowered them into the water while the Lexington was still underway. Dangerously overfilling the boats, the passengers dropped them into the black water that was still swirling past, agitated by the thrashing paddle wheels. The boats, along with their helpless occupants, were immediately swamped and swept into the night. The remaining passengers were left to fend for themselves, and none of them knew which way to turn. Few jumped into the water. Drowning was nearly as unthinkable as being incinerated. Captain Hillard, one of the sea captains who was traveling home that night, rounded up a few deckhands and a small band of passengers and directed them to throw overboard any cotton bales that had not caught fire. After a dozen were heaved over the side, Captain Hillard and stoker Benjamin Cox climbed down and positioned themselves astride a bale, each facing the other. Their combined weight settled the cotton bale until only 1/3 of it was above the surface of the water. The wind was fresh, and the current carried them away from the boat at a speed of a knot and a half. As Hillard drifted around the stern, by the light of the fire, it was 8 p.m. An immense billowing cloud of black smoke was reaching hundreds of feet into the sky, blocking out the stars. The main deck had fallen in, and the only parts of the boat the flames had yet to devour were the stern and the bows forward of the capstan. 10 people still stood on the stern, while 30 more milled around the forecastle, including Captain Manchester. A dazed Adolphus Harnden asked the captain, "Shouldn't we jump or something?" "To do so would be to perish. It's every man for himself." Manchester turned away and lowered himself over the side onto a raft of debris. There were 2 or 3 other men on it already, and his added weight sank it under the water. He grabbed a piece of the railing that was underwater and used it to pull himself onto a bale of cotton that was floating nearby. He found that passenger Peter McKenna had climbed aboard the bale first. Harnden, still on the forecastle, shouted to Manchester, "Is there room for another?" Before Manchester could answer, Harnden jumped, knocking McKenna off the bale and falling in the water with him. Ignoring Harnden, Manchester hauled McKenna back on the bale. Then he found a length of board that was floating past and began paddling away from the blazing boat. As had Captain Hillard earlier when abandoning the boat, he checked his watch. It was just midnight. Lexington had burned for over 4 hours. At 3 o'clock, more than 7 hours after the fire was discovered, cold water surged through the cremated interior of the hull, and the smoldering remains of the steamboat slipped beneath the cold waters of the Sound. Steam mingled with smoke to create a pall that was slowly carried away by wind. And soon the flotsam drifted away, leaving the grave of the Lexington shrouded and unmarked by a merciless sea. Captain Hillard and Benjamin Cox had drifted about a mile from the Lexington when she went down. The night air was incredibly cold, and the men tried to keep warm by whipping their hands and arms around their bodies. Cox had abandoned the boat wearing only a flannel shirt, loose-fitting pants, boots, and a cap. An old mariner, Hillard had wisely worn his heavy woolen pea-jacket. He gave Cox his vest and then rubbed Cox's arms and legs, beat him on the body, and made every attempt to keep his blood circulating. Cox was beyond caring. His body limped in and the frigid air sucked the life from his body. He babbled about his wife and child, how he had kissed them the morning he left home. Manchester tried to encourage him. "You'll be with them this time tomorrow. Move about, man. Get your blood flowing. Wave your arms. What good will it do? We're both going to perish." "Speak for yourself. I'll be damned if I'll give up." McKenna appeared not to hear and went silent. Manchester could do nothing but watch helplessly as McKenna gave in to fate. He died shortly after the Lexington sank. His body fell backward, his head hanging partially in the water. The first heavy wave that struck the bale washed him off. For almost half an hour he floated alongside Manchester, the moonlight reflecting on his white face and hands. Then he finally drifted out of sight. From the pier at Southport, Captain Oliver Meeker of the sloop Merchant had seen the Lexington on fire and had tried to set sail. But the combination of the shallow harbor and a falling tide caused the Merchant to run aground. With the coming of the sun, the sea turned smooth, and Captain Meeker, who had labored through to dawn, unloading cargo to lighten his vessel, was finally able to work his sloop off the sandbar with the incoming tide and set sail into the Sound. Perched on his cotton bale, Hillard sighted the Merchant at about noon, feeling fingers and wave it feebly in a light breeze. Observed by Meeker's alert crew, he was soon thawing out beside Captain Hillard in the galley of the Merchant. The most remarkable story of survival was that of second mate David Crowley. Luckily, his bale did not capsize or roll heavily with the sea, enabling him to burrow a nest into the center of the cotton. With his clothing stuffed with cotton until he looked like a fat snowman, he kept from freezing to death. Unseen by Captain Meeker's crew, Crowley suffered all day Tuesday and through the night. Not until 9 o'clock Wednesday night did his cotton bale drift against an ice pack along the Long Island shore. Afraid he might fall through into the frigid water, Crowley crawled across the ice on his stomach until he reached land. Then he stumbled nearly a mile to a house and rapped down the door with the last of his strength. The residents, Matthias and Mary Hutchinson, thought they were looking at a bloated dead body, dressed only in bulging light pants and a shirt with a bared head. They were astounded when the warmth of the house and their vigorous massage of his limbs brought Crowley back to life. He had suffered 48 hours of freezing cold on his floating cotton raft, and had drifted over 50 miles. Shortly after his miraculous survival, the owners of the cotton on board the Lexington presented second mate Crowley with the same bale that had carried him to land. He had it transported to his home in Providence, Rhode Island, where he kept it standing in his living room for many years. When the price of cotton skyrocketed during the Civil War, Crowley sold his bale for charity. From it sprang the famous Lexington brand of cotton cloth. There was another intriguing sequel to the burning of the Lexington. The man that arrived late on the dock, and who wisely decided not to make an attempt to jump onto the Lexington, read of the disaster in the extra edition of a newspaper late the next morning. He could not believe his luck. He folded the newspaper, set it aside, and asked the waiter for a sheet of the hotel's stationery and an envelope. He began writing his wife and father to inform them that their husband and son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, was still alive and well. The casing around the smokestack ignited a fire that was communicated to the cotton bales stacked around it. Yet no one was indicted, convicted, paid a fine, or lost a license. All that remained were hearts overwhelmed with grief, and nearly 300 fatherless and motherless children. For all but 7 of the dead, there would be no tomb. On September 30th, 1842, this item appeared in a weekly paper, The Long Islander, in Huntington, New York. Quote, "The Lexington. The wreck of this ill-fated vessel has been raised to the surface of the water, but, one of the chains breaking, she again sank in 130 feet of water. The attempt is again in progress. The $800 recovered from her were not in bills, as before stated, but in a lump of silver weighing 30 pounds, the box having been emptied on the deck to be used as a bucket for throwing water on the flames."
Enter NUMA, the National Underwater and Marine Agency, in April of 1983. I can't remember what initially sparked my interest in the Lexington. I believe it might have been an afterthought I've come to rely on when looking for a particular shipwreck is to research other ships that went down in the same general area. Should my primary target prove too elusive or impossible to find within my time schedule, I can hunt for a second or third wreck. Unable to find a solid magnetic signature of the Savannah, I decided to give her a rain check, and I moved the search crew across Long Island into the Sound for an attempt at discovering the steamboat Lexington, lost for nearly 150 years. Bob Fleming, a nationally respected Washington, D.C. researcher and shipwreck scholar who works with me on a regular basis, put me onto the track of the ill-starred steamboat. Fleming sent me the story behind the tragedy. Cursed with a vivid imagination, I could almost hear the cries of the Lexington's victims begging for someone to find their tomb. Margaret Dubitsky, a Long Island schoolteacher who worked long and hard in compiling a remarkable research package from New York state and local archives, found references to the steamboat being raised. One vague report claimed it was brought to the surface and towed away, suggesting it no longer lay at the bottom of the Sound. Raising a 200-foot vessel from 130 feet of water is a feat rarely, if ever, attempted today. Difficulties with weather, unpredictable seas, the heavy lifting equipment involved, and the expense can be enormous. Having the technology in 1842 to accomplish such an undertaking seems incredible. Hard hat diving was in its infancy. Decompression tables were unknown. And then there had to be a barge and a crane with the capacity to lift a 488-ton vessel to the surface. But everyone, it seemed, claimed that because she couldn't be found, she must no longer exist. Shoving all pessimistic thoughts aside, I felt strongly that it was conceivable the Lexington might still rest in the murky depths, forgotten and untouched for almost a century and a half. So I forged ahead and formed an expedition to search for the wreckage. I began analyzing the historical material. Where exactly was the Lexington when she found coordinates? Nor did they estimate their position by the stars or dead reckoning. They used visual sightings. Logbooks from ships sailing the Sound simply contained entries stating that Oak Neck Point was abeam at 9:35 p.m. Few other details on position were given. The Lexington left few clues. Of all the sightings from witnesses on shore, I placed my faith in the old field lighthouse keeper, who reported seeing the flames die about 4 miles slightly to the west. Figuring that he was a good judge of distance across water, I laid out an initial grid of 4 square miles in his approximate area, and the search was on. The first attempt was spent primarily in studying the area, bottom conditions, run of the tide, and underwater visibility. Captain Tony Bresna, with his boat the day off, anchored us over a sunken barge, and we made a test dive into the Sound. 1 to 2 feet of visibility was not unexpected, much stronger than estimated. We figured close to 4 knots. And all divers were holding onto the anchor chain while stretched horizontal like flags in a windstorm. We also discovered that half our search grid passed under the path of the Bridgeport-Port Jefferson ferry that ran between the mainland and Long Island during the summers. In continuous operation since 1874, it provided an excellent reason why fishermen didn't fish and divers didn't dive in the neighborhood and maybe happen upon a shipwreck. For the second attempt, we assembled a first-rate crew. The Mikado III, captained by Mike Arnell, an experienced dive master, was chartered. Equipment included a Schoenstatt gradiometer to detect the presence of iron, a Klein & Associates side-scan sonar to record objects protruding from the sea bottom, and a Loran navigation unit, now made obsolete by newer global positioning systems utilizing satellites. For once, the tedium of running search lanes did not cause uncontrolled yawning. Our sonar technician announced not 1, but 3 solid targets the first hour into the search. Subsequent runs over the targets suggested 1 large vessel broken into 3 sections. In one sonar recording, the engine's walking beam and a large section of the guard from a paddle wheel could be detected. Captain Mike Arnell then expertly moored the Mikado III directly over the wreck so the divers could descend on the anchor line, 140 feet on the boat's echo sounder. Using a safety line, we made narrow sweeps of the central section of the wreckage. With the divers restricted to only 10 minutes of bottom time, major exploration was severely limited. The divers brought up a few bolts and pieces of charred wood. They reported seeing one of the paddle wheels and more charred timbers, and described the hull construction as looking like an egg crate, verifying Lexington's unusual box frame. It is a pity you cannot stand on the sandy bottom, step back, and view the wreckage in its entirety. The length of the burned and broken hull, the great paddle wheels, the walking beams of the engines, they are more imagined than seen. The dismal, green, murky water allows you only a few close-up glimpses of how the ship must have once appeared. You feel as if you're groping through a haunted house in the dead of night, glimpsing its ghosts from the corner of one eye. Because of the many hours of research, I had felt as though I had walked the decks of the Lexington. But to the other divers, she was simply a pile of debris on the bottom. After we assembled the artifacts and cataloged them, I sent a piece of timber to Robert Baldwin, a leading expert in wood of the steamship. It turned out that the lighthouse keeper was close to the mark. Instead of 4 miles north and slightly west, the wreck of the Lexington was found 3.5 miles north and slightly west. A final word of caution. Diving the Lexington can be very dangerous. The tides are treacherous and can run as high as 4 knots. Ambient light is almost non-existent, and disorientation is a sure bet unless the diver makes good use of a guideline attached to the anchor chain. I highly recommend that you dive only during slack tide to avoid a nasty current.
The Confederate submarine Hunley, February 1864. A sand crab scurried along the beach and darted into a hole. Lieutenant George Dixon of the Confederate States glanced at the crab briefly, at the sea at a ship that rose and dropped on the late afternoon swells. From 4.5 miles away, the vessel seemed like a small dark toy, rocking against a curtain of Wedgwood blue. The sails on her yards were furled, and a wisp of smoke curled from her stack, indicating that her furnaces were being kept stoked and fired, so she could move quickly should her lookouts spot a blockade runner trying to sneak into Charleston Harbor. "What ship do you make her out to be, sir?" "The Housatonic, a spanking brand new Yankee sloop of war, fresh out of a Union shipyard. A fast ship, equal or superior to any commerce runner I know." "Not for long, sir." Dixon smiled and nodded. "God willing, tonight's the night." An hour after sunset, the 9-man crew of the Confederate States submarine Horace L. Hunley walked onto the wooden dock in the channel behind Sullivan's Island. The iron hump of the submarine, with her 2 hatch towers and a 20-foot pipe that extended from her bow, were all that were visible above the water. 2 crewmen attached the torpedo to the end of the iron pipe. A heavy barb, attached to a copper canister containing 100 pounds of black powder, was inserted over the end of the pipe like a thimble on a finger. Then the crewman checked the line attached to a reel, set to pull the detonating trigger. In theory, after the barb was embedded beneath an enemy hull, Hunley was supposed to back off at least 150 yards before the line reached the end of the reel and detonated the charge. But the mechanism had yet to be fully tested. Canteens of water, a small container of food, and a lantern with a blue lens were passed to those already inside the submarine. This was a night mission that would take from sunset to sunrise. The crew members of Hunley were conditioned to enduring damp cold, a claustrophobic existence, and physical exertion that left them with aching muscles and in a near state of total exhaustion. Seaman Frank Collins walked back to the dock from Breach Inlet, the channel that split Isle of Palms from Sullivan's Island. Seat next to the rear ballast tank, did Dixon snake through the forward hatch. He came to a standing position behind the boat's steering wheel, mercury diving indicator, and compass. Dixon made a motion with his hand to the sentries standing on the dock. "Stand by to cast off." He motioned to Seaman Wicks, and both men threw off the hemp lines looped around the hatch towers. The sentries pulled in the lines and pushed the submarine away from the dock with their feet. Hunley swayed in the water until Dixon gave the command to move forward. Then the 8 men behind him began turning the crank that was connected to the propeller at the stern, and Hunley moved slowly toward the end of Sullivan's Island, where she joined the tidal current sweeping through Breach Inlet into the sea beyond. For weeks the crew had propelled themselves toward the Union fleet, only to be turned back by bad luck. More than once they had approached so close to enemy picket boats that when Dixon raised the hatch for fresh air, they could hear the Yankee sailors singing and talking in the darkness. Now, once again, they lit candles to illuminate their coffin-like container and set them in holders bolted to the iron wall. Tonight was to be their night. The moon was a crescent and the sea calm. Maintaining a slow rhythm as they cranked the propeller and taking advantage of the outgoing tide, they moved along at nearly 4 knots for the first mile. The cold interior soon turned warm from their body heat, and the walls dripped with condensation from their breathing. Dixon, able to keep the forward hatch open because of the smooth sea, stared over the top as he steered the sub toward the lights of Housatonic. Time crawled as the men pushed and pulled on their crank handles. They began working in 20-minute shifts, 4 men on, 4 men off, to conserve. Parted in a smile. "We'll not go home empty-handed this night." Dixon carefully wiped the 3 tiny glass viewing ports in the hatch tower. They had become clouded with moisture from the humidity created by the breathing and sweating of the men inside. Through the forward port he studied Housatonic. The ship was anchored with her bow pointing west by northwest toward Fort Sumter. Hunley was slowly approaching on an angle, astern and slightly off the starboard quarter of the Union warship. There was no sign the sub had been observed. When he spotted the floating buoys that supported the outer net around the ship, he made a crucial decision. "Mr. Wicks, fill your ballast tank to the quarter mark." Everyone went silent and stared at each other questioningly. They all expected the lieutenant to ask for 2/3 ballast, enough to slide Hunley under the surface and out of sight to the lookouts on board Housatonic. "Begging your pardon, sir, we'll not be attacking underwater?" "We've come too far, Mr. Wicks, to miss her in water blacker than ink. Besides, she has a protective net sunk along her hull. We'll go in over the net with only our hatch towers awash and place the charge just below their waterline." In less than a minute, the correct amount of water was pumped into the forward and aft ballast tanks. The sub sank beneath the surface until only a narrow band of upper hull and both hatch towers were exposed. "Now, crank hard, crank like hell. We're attacking." Before turning in for the night, Captain Charles Pickering walked the deck of his command, USS Housatonic, for a final inspection. He stopped and gazed over the black water outside of Charleston, at the lights of the steam sloop Canandaigua. Larger and more heavily armed than his ship, Canandaigua was stationed 1 mile further to sea, as part of the stranglehold to intercept commercial ships attempting to supply the Confederacy. Pickering turned and gazed with contentment across the length of his own ship. She was prepared for any threat, above water or below. One of 4 new screw sloops, without entangling herself in the chain. Satisfied, Captain Pickering retired to his ornate cedar-trimmed cabin. Watch Officer John Crosby stood on the bridge, peering through binoculars for telltale sparks from the stack of a blockade runner. At about 8:45 p.m., Crosby saw something in the water that he thought at first was a porpoise. He hailed the nearest lookout, who was stationed in the rigging above him. "Do you see anything in the water about 100 yards off the starboard quarter?" "No, sir. Only a small ripple on the water." "Look again. I see something coming toward us very fast." "I see it now, Lieutenant. It has 2 knobs showing on the surface." Crosby prodded awake a young drummer boy. "Beat to quarters." Then he gave orders to slip the anchor chain and rang the engine room to back the ship. His orders were carried out in less than 20 seconds. The propeller was already turning when the executive officer, Lieutenant Frank Higginson, rushed on deck. "Is it a blockade runner?" Crosby shook his head and pointed over the side. "There it is. It looks like that damned torpedo boat." Captain Pickering raced from his quarters, carrying a double-barreled shotgun. To Pickering, the torpedo boat was shaped like a large upside-down whaleboat, with 2 projections a third of the way from each end. He leveled his shotgun at the strange craft in the water. "Go astern, faster!" Higginson grabbed a rifle from a lookout and also opened fire. He was soon joined by others. Ensign Charles Craven, seeing that small arms fire was useless, ran to the nearest 32-pound gun and attempted to train it on the object in the water, now backing away from Housatonic. He was about to pull the lanyard when the deck suddenly rose beneath his feet. The instant the barb rammed through the copper sheathing of the hull of the Housatonic, Dixon cried out, "Reverse the crank, quickly!" The men inside the submarine furiously reversed the direction of their cranking, and the little craft slowly backed away from her adversary. Dixon could look up through the viewport and see men shooting over the railing of the Housatonic. He was certain the barb containing the charge had penetrated and gripped the hull. Now they had to get clear and detonate the charge. Then Dixon spied a gun, a 32-pounder, being trained on Hunley. The submarine was now 50 yards away, far short of the required distance to safely survive the explosion. Dixon realized they were within seconds of being shot out of the water. He saw no choice but to gamble and hope the odds ran in his favor. He intended to crack the hatch cover, snake out an arm, grip the detonation line with his hand, and trigger the explosion himself. Before he could act, a shot from a revolver struck the surface of the water, except Housatonic's masts and rigging. The shock wave from the explosion affected the men inside Hunley far worse than it did the crew of Housatonic. The concussion knocked the wind out of them and threw them against the crank and walls of the submarine. As an explosion-driven wave surged over Hunley, it twisted her sideways and pitched her up and down like a raft through rapids. Until now, George Dixon had no way of knowing the effects that an underwater explosion might have on a submarine at so near a distance. In the middle of the submarine, one seaman's head jerked back against the inside of the hull, then forward against the crank handle, rendering him immediately unconscious. Another smashed his chin while the man next to him wrenched his back. The artilleryman fell against the crank on the rebound as well, snapping a front tooth cleanly in half. There was no panic or chaos inside the submarine. Most simply sat in a state of shock before the triumph of their feat began to sink in. Dixon shook the cobwebs from his dazed mind and peered through a viewport. Already the tide had carried Hunley another 50 yards to the southeast, away from the sinking ship, and he could see that Housatonic was settling fast. "What happened, Lieutenant? Do we get her?" Wicks asked. "Take a look through the rear viewports. We sank the damn Yankee." The tension was suddenly released. After incredible adversity, they had put their lives on the line and won. Hunley had vindicated herself. She had finally accomplished what she had been designed to do. Dixon was still cautious. "We're not out of the woods yet. Take up the crank. I want to put another 300 yards between us and Housatonic before the Union fleet is alerted to her sinking." The crew propelled the craft as if their pain and fatigue did not exist. Dixon spun the wheel and steered a course eastward a quarter of a mile before he turned the bow toward Breach Inlet. Once he felt they were a safe distance away, he ordered his crew to stop. At 9:20 p.m., a lifeboat pulled alongside the Union warship Canandaigua. Captain Joseph Green immediately made his way to the railing. "What boat are you?" The seaman answered, "From the Housatonic. We were sunk by a rebel torpedo craft. What's left of our crew is clinging to the rigging." The captain immediately hoisted distress signals and sent up rockets to alert the rest of the fleet. Then Canandaigua slipped her anchor chain and came directly to Housatonic's assistance. They arrived at the sunken ship at 9:35 p.m., lowered their boats, and began picking up the men clinging to the rigging. None of the officers and crew of Canandaigua reported anything unusual or out of the ordinary during their run to rescue the survivors of Housatonic. Too late, Dixon felt a vibration in the water through the iron sides of Hunley. Too late, he discovered the lights of the ship coming to rescue Housatonic's survivors. The bow of the Union warship looming up in the dark. The shock of the impact rolled Hunley over on her side and pushed her deep into the sea. Iron plates separated, and water burst inside, filling the interior within seconds. 131 years would pass before anyone learned where or why the crew of the submarine Hunley died. The story of the little undersea craft that entered the history books as the first submarine to sink a warship, a feat that would not happen again until the U-21 torpedoed the British cruiser HMS Pathfinder in World War I, began in New Orleans early in 1861. The craft that became famous as the Hunley torpedo boat was amazingly advanced for her time. Her hull configuration was very similar to the much later Nautilus nuclear sub-designs. She had diving planes attached on each side of the hull, manual pumps to increase or decrease water balance. Electrical battery power and diesel engines were far over the horizon. She had to rely on 8 strong men to turn the crank that rotated her propeller. General Pierre Beauregard, commanding the Charleston, South Carolina defenses, requested the submarine be transported to his district to eliminate the Union fleet blockading the harbor. Horace Hunley, one of the financial backers, and his co-builders jumped at the opportunity. Hunley was commandeered in the name of the Confederacy, and a crew of Navy men under the command of Lieutenant John Payne came aboard to try their luck. They drew a losing hand. A short time later, through inexperience, Payne caused the boat to dive while he was caught in a rope snarled in the hatch cover. The open hatches tilted underwater and the submarine sank. Payne leaped free, shouting for his men to abandon ship. 5 men drowned. Hunley was on the scoreboard with her first victims. She was raised, her dead removed, and the interior dried out. Horace Hunley volunteered the services of the team who created her, including Thomas Parks, in whose shop the craft had been constructed, and Lieutenant George Dixon. Beauregard accepted. Hunley and his people arrived and promptly put the submarine. Dixon, who normally commanded the sub, was not present that day, and Hunley took the helm for a practice dive. For some unknown reason, the boat was also short by one other member of her crew. Hunley steered for the Indian Chief, a receiving ship used by the Confederate Navy to support the harbor mine operations. The sub's commander had 2 options for underwater running. He could flood the ballast tanks until the hatch towers were barely above water, and then take her down by tilting the diving planes, thereby controlling the angle for desired depth. His second choice, and the easier for his human propulsion system, was to flood the tanks until he achieved neutral buoyancy at the correct depth, the same basic method used on all modern submarines. When Hunley was ready to come up, he and Thomas Parks pumped the water ballast from the tanks in unison, and the sub rose to the surface, providing all went smoothly. But this day, something went terribly wrong. It was another case of human error. Hunley had miscalculated his angle of descent and allowed the forward ballast tank to overflow. The sub lost trim and rammed its nose deep into the bottom mud. Now one of the engineering defects came into play. The bulkheads for the ballast tanks did not extend to the top of the hull roof, and the forward tank began to overflow, the water pouring into the main compartment. In a last-ditch attempt to save themselves, the men made an effort to escape through the hatches and swim to the surface. The covers would not budge, sealed tight by the water pressure. When the bodies were recovered, most still clutched candles in their hands. The score was now Hunley 13, the Confederacy nothing. Despite his reservations, Beauregard ordered the Hunley to be salvaged. The sub was propped on a wharf until he could figure out what to do with her. The majority of those who voiced criticism demanded that now her crew was recovered, she should be dumped back on the bottom and left there. Beauregard called a halt to any further underwater operations. There were only two who argued with his decision, Lieutenants George Dixon and William Alexander. Both refused to accept defeat. Together they persuaded a reluctant Beauregard that it was a terrible waste to forget the heroic efforts of the dead and ignore the potential threat of the submarine to the blockading Union fleet. Less than enthusiastic, Beauregard finally relented and gave in, but only on the condition that any attacks on the enemy be made with the sub afloat, not submerged. The two with the incoming tide. Beauregard was most impressed with the performance, and ordered that the submarine and her crew be given whatever assistance the Army and Navy could provide. With renewed support, Dixon took the craft out whenever weather permitted, taking ever greater risks in futile attempts to reach their targets. Dixon carried on until he was lost that fateful night of February 17th, 1864.
There are unlucky ships, and there are unlucky ships, but the Confederate submarine Hunley has to hold some kind of record. 3 times she sank, 2 times she was raised. Over 20 men died within her iron walls. 9 still lie entombed there. For someone like me, addicted to the mysteries of the sea, Hunley cast a spell that I found about as irresistible as a starving cat staring at an overweight rodent exercising on a treadmill. Through the decades, after she triumphed and vanished into oblivion, many tried to find the little sub that could, and all failed. Claims were made of discovery, but none were substantiated. All that was known for certain was that she was never seen again. Theories of concussion and drift out to sea unconscious or dead before the sub sank. Could the blast have loosened her plates and rivets, causing her to sink before completing the return voyage to Breach Inlet? Here was a mystery with 1,000 clues, but no conclusive leads. I never accepted her fate as united with Housatonic. The post-Civil War salvor, Benjamin Malafert, was no slouch. He extensively salvaged the Union sloop of war and emphatically wrote in his diaries that he found no trace of Hunley. Lieutenant Churchill and the salvaged schooner G.W. Blunt dragged the bottom 500 yards around the Housatonic, finding nothing of the torpedo boat. After the war, diver Angus Smith and his brother searched 5 acres around the wreck, hoping to cash in on P.T. Barnum's $100,000 reward for the famous sub. In a letter dated 1876, Smith said that he had sat on the fish torpedo boat that was lying alongside the Housatonic and could raise her at any time. But, like so many who followed with their claims of discovery, Smith never produced a shred of evidence. In 1908, diver William Verdon was awarded a contract by the Army Corps of Engineers to lower the wreck of the Housatonic, because it had become a menace to navigation. After raising 4 tons of old iron and blasting the remains of Housatonic to smithereens, he received $3,240 and stated that he saw no signs of the submarine. Resting in the archives at Suitland, Maryland, and unopened for 120 years, the testimony by Housatonic crewmen reported that the torpedo boat had pulled back close to 50 yards before the explosion. One of the ships climbed to the rigging ahead of the rising water. Under further questioning, he stated, when the Canandaigua got astern and was lying athwart of the Housatonic, about 4 ship lengths off, while I was in the fore rigging, I saw a blue light on the water just ahead of the Canandaigua and on the starboard quarter of the Housatonic. This was enough for me to believe the Hunley had left the site of the sinking. It was also a billboard advertising the resting place and the fate of the submarine, but I failed to grasp the significance. There was also the report by Colonel O.M. Dantzler, commanding Battery Marshal off Breach Inlet, where the Hunley's dock was located. Dantzler said, "I have the honor to report that the torpedo boat stationed at this post went out on the night of the 17th instant and has not returned. The signals agreed upon to be given in case the boat wished a light to be exposed at this post as a guide for its return were observed and answered. An earlier report would have been made of this matter, but the officer of the day for yesterday was under the impression that the boat had returned and so informed me." There were those who were skeptical of this report, especially about the part where the Hunley's lights were observed and answered. They thought perhaps Colonel Dantzler was lax, had ignored the failure of the submarine to return, and was covering his tail by blaming his officer of the day. I disagreed, and initially bought the report as truth, and so I originally laid out our search grid close to the shore, figuring a blue light held on the surface of the water could not be seen much over a mile. Relying on Colonel Dantzler was a miscalculation I later regretted. In July of 1980, the Numa team began to stay in a run-down motel whose little old stucco bungalows looked as if they might have served as a meeting and storage facility for Prohibition bootleggers. We certainly had a diverse crew, including Doc Harold Edgerton, who arrived with his side-scan sonar and sub-bottom penetrator, Peter Throckmorton, who had launched ancient shipwreck archaeology in the Mediterranean, and our resident psychic from Duke University, Karen Getzler, appeared to head up our magic department. Adding to the gala festivities, everyone's wife and girlfriend also showed up. Miraculously, everyone got along and had a jolly time, and the escapades on shore were only matched by those at sea. The crew of the Zodiac inflatable boat that I had chartered to run search lines close to shore consisted of Bill Shea, who scanned the proton magnetometer, Dan Koski-Carell directing the navigation, and my son Dirk, who steered and operated the boat's outboard motor. In those years, the most accurate navigation system for running tight 30-meter lanes was the Motorola Mini Ranger. We found that rather than mounting the equipment in an already crowded boat, it was more efficient to direct the search from a van on shore via radio. Each morning, the search team would proceed through Breach Inlet, the same channel used by Hunley 120 years previous, and then take up a base position as instructed by the Mini Ranger operators. While the Zodiac searched for Hunley along the shore, working out toward the open sea, our second boat surveyed the site of Housatonic. Probes pretty well established the outline of the remaining hull and one boiler. There was no indication of the submarine. No cartoon series could have done this part of the expedition justice. The other boat was an old, dilapidated 27-foot cabin cruiser called the Coastal Explorer, long past its prime. Though she broke down every afternoon like clockwork, repairs were made and she somehow always brought us home. The boat was owned and captained by a truly nice guy whose name was Robert Johnson. We affectionately referred to him as Skipper Bob. His two crewmen, who were students at the famous Charleston Citadel, were a pair of real characters. We called them Heckle and Jekyll. What they lacked in finesse, they more than made up with humor. One day, the sea was a bit choppy and the door to the cabin kept swinging open and then banging shut. The latch was either non-existent or broken. Skipper Bob gave the order, "Fix that damn door!" Heckle and Jekyll sprang into action. As Doc Edgerton and I watched in fascination, Heckle grabbed a huge sledgehammer as Jekyll snatched a nail the size of a railroad spike. Then, in one deft motion, they drove the spike through the bottom door. Skipper Bob nodded with satisfaction, seemingly immune to the damage to his boat. The Coastal Explorer follies continued without let-up. The crew was especially fascinated by psychic Karen Getzley as she sat on the bow and tried to tune in on Hunley's location. Seemingly going into a trance and holding up her hands as if they were antennas, she could envision the bits and pieces of scenes during the sinking, but she could not pin down a precise site. I'm convinced psychics can see things in their minds that go far beyond anything I can imagine. The problem for psychics with locating a sunken ship is that there are no landmarks on open water. Still, they're fun to work with, and I never hesitate to give them a chance to try their powers. Despite a short run, the Numa Follies managed to eliminate a 2-mile-long grid beginning at Breach Inlet and extending a half-mile out to sea. We were now reasonably sure that the elusive little submarine had not gone down close to shore or in the surf, but must be lying further out toward Housatonic. I've always affectionately recalled the expedition as the great trauma of '80. Most of the old gang, Walter Shobe, put us in a big, comfortable house on the beach at Isle of Palms. He even obtained the services of a cook. She turned out sumptuous meals, usually drowning in grease. I love that old southern down-home cooking. Give me red-eye gravy and biscuits, grits with butter, and chicory in my coffee, and I'm ready to snatch up a sword and lead Pickett's charge up Cemetery Ridge. This expedition went as smoothly as a fashion model's shaven leg. We were generously offered a top-of-the-line archaeological dive team and first-rate outboard boat. The total crew ballooned to 17 people with the arrival of half a dozen young volunteers. The equipment ticked away without missing a beat, the weather cooperated with smooth seas, and the only injuries, luckily, were sunburn, seasickness, and hangovers. Running 30-meter lanes, we searched a total of 16 square miles. Success was mingled with failure. Although we did not find Hunley, we discovered 5 Confederate blockade runners and 3 Union ironclads. One episode occurred during the expedition and still haunts a few of us. Late one afternoon, we accidentally ran over a large metallic anomaly while returning to the zigzagged across the graph in the blink of an eye. An anomaly with a large iron mass from the look of it. We immediately turned back to the site and ran a grid pattern until we picked it up again. Then we threw in a buoy and anchored. We had 2 student archaeologists on board, Bob Browning and Wilson West. Those 2, along with Coast Guardsman Tim Fermi, dove in and began probing the site. Within minutes, West came to the surface and announced, "We've got an object over 30 feet long by about 4 feet wide. Don't quote me, but the ends appear to be tapered." Anticipation set 8 hearts pounding. The time was nearly 6 o'clock, but we had a good 2 hours of daylight left. So we raced to the dock, lifted a suction dredge on the boat, and hightailed it back to our buoy. With Ralph Wilbanks and Rodney Warren in the water operating the dredge, the rest of us sat and waited expectantly. Sharks often appeared during a dredging operation, attracted by the sea life caught up in the induction hose. One did come snooping while the divers were down, and we threw cans of Pepsi and shouted at it until it swam off in search of easier pickings. It was nearly dark when the divers surfaced, and we called it quits. Ralph drew a sketch of what he and Rodney found after digging a 2-foot hole. It appeared to be a 1/4-inch piece of iron standing at an angle and attached to a metal plate that disappeared in the silt. Since they saw no rivets holding the object in place, it looked as if the object was welded to the plate. Knowing that metal welding was as yet unknown in the 1860s, we assumed that what we found was a sunken Coast Guard buoy, approximately the same size and mass as the Hunley. By this point, time had run out, and the search for Hunley came up as empty as a hermit's address book. She still refused to be found. I can't really explain why it took me 13 years to give the sub another go. Perhaps I developed a mental block or just wasn't in the mood. For various reasons, some shipwrecks can never be located. I did not believe this to be the case with the Hunley. Many were those who said it wasn't there simply because it had been sold all over again. Walt came early and arranged for boats and lodging. I've frequently complained about returning to certain towns or cities for another attempt at finding a shipwreck, but I was always happy to come back to Charleston. There are few cities finer in Carolina and most other states. The people are cordial and as affable as old friends. The city is picturesque, and what is especially appealing to someone like me with sensitive taste buds and a warehouse for a stomach, they have great restaurants. Despite its being the middle of summer, we were greeted with mild and balmy weather. Walt had hired the services of Ralph Wilbanks, who headed his own underwater survey company, Diversified Wilbanks. Humorous, with a sly smile fixed beneath a Pancho Villa mustache, he worked tirelessly day after day, fighting choppy water to keep the search boat on track with never a discouraging word. His partner, who watched over the detection gear, was Wes Hall, archaeologist and owner of Mid-Atlantic Technology. Their endurance was little short of incredible. The hours running search lanes seemed a lifetime, but they never wavered. From 8 a.m. till 8 p.m., they hung tough, hour after hour. Visitors who came on board thinking they would find the search filled with thrills inevitably asked to be taken back to the dock after 2 or 3 hours. If they didn't become seasick, they were dying from tedium. The hunt for shipwrecks takes dedication and perseverance. Leisure time comes only when you step onto a nice, steady dock. After eliminating another 10 square miles and identifying several buried anomalies as old sunken trash, our third attempt at finding Hunley slowly wound down and was written off as another failure. To me, this was a hard setback. What piece of evidence had I overlooked? Had I misinterpreted the research? Earlier, I had relied on Colonel Dantzler's report and concentrated the search between Breach Inlet and Housatonic. But Hunley was not there. The only straw left to grasp was in expanding the borders of the search grids. Determined to find Hunley and her crew before my final death, they agreed, and I returned home to Colorado to write another book and pay for all the madness. Ralph and Wes went out, rain or shine, and searched the grids I faxed them through the fall and winter of '94 and into the spring of '95. And then on May 4th, I received a phone call from Ralph at 6 in the morning. I was still half asleep when I heard him say, "Well, I guess I'm going to have to send you my final bill. Are you giving up?" "No," said Ralph calmly. "We found it. It's a done deal. We dug through the silt and came in contact with the forward hatch tower. Then we uncovered the snorkel box on the port dive fin." I held my breath and asked, Where did you find her?" "About 1,000 yards east and slightly south of the Housatonic." "Then it survived the explosion, but had yet to begin its return voyage to Breach Inlet." "Looks that way," said Ralph. "Isn't that about where we dove in '81, on that object we thought was a Coast Guard buoy?" Ralph sighed. "I've had nightmares over that for 14 years, but I'm not going to let myself believe we misidentified it." The answer had been lurking in the dust of time. I had previously ignored Seaman Fleming's sighting of the blue light while awaiting rescue in the rigging because I saw no reason for Hunley to hang around the area for nearly an hour, risking capture before the Union warship Canandaigua arrived to rescue Housatonic survivors. The problem lay in my miscalculation of the time high tide turned to ebb, and the water began sweeping toward the shore. I put it too early. For some inexplicable reason, I assumed the tide reversed soon after the sinking, not 2 hours later. Too tired to crank their propeller against the adverse current, Hunley's crew must have moved away from the Housatonic and waited until the tide worked to their advantage and carried them home. But that didn't answer why she sank and disappeared. Again, Fleming produced the key when he stated that he saw the blue light just ahead of Canandaigua. That suggests that Hunley's crew had perhaps thrown open the hatch covers to soak in the fresh night air while waiting. Or perhaps, as the closed hatch covers indicate, the Union warship unknowingly rammed Hunley and sent her to the bottom. Someday soon, when the submarine is raised, we'll have the final solution.
Southampton, England. Shuffling slowly forward, more than 2,000 GIs of the United States Army's 66th Infantry Division, known as the Black Panthers, milled about Pier 38, waiting to board the troop ship Leopoldville. Like a lethargic disease, a general lack of enthusiasm had infected the men. World War II was 6 months past D-Day and winding down to a conclusion, or so everyone thought. Word had spread about the German army launching a counterattack referred to as the Battle of the Bulge, but few took any stock in the rumor, merely a last gasp by the Germans, who were on the verge of surrender. They couldn't have been more wrong. The massive German assault had shattered American forces in the Ardennes forest. Torn from the prospect of an enjoyable Christmas in their warm barracks, 2,235 men of the 66th were now standing in the freezing air and waiting to board Leopoldville, while the rest of the division was loaded aboard the HMT Cheshire. The Cheshire was a British transport, newer and in better shape than the Belgian liner. The men of the 66th were finally cleared to board 2 hours after midnight of the 24th. With the snarling Black Panther patches worn proudly on the sleeves of their olive-drab winter coats, the men trooped aboard Leopoldville. Disorganization was the order of the day. They were hurriedly assigned compartments as they stepped onto the main deck. Units were broken up, dividing friends, splitting squads from their companies. Platoon Sergeant Robert Hesse of Heavy Weapons Platoon Company D, 264th Regiment, dutifully followed instructions directing him and his buddies through an open hatch and down a steep wooden stairway into cargo holds that had been converted into cramped quarters for transporting troops. Hesse, a 20-year-old from Roselle, New York, dropped his pack, duffel bag, and rifle onto the crowded deck and removed his helmet, muttering to no one in particular, "So, this is home for Christmas." In the Leopoldville's wheelhouse, Captain Charles Limbour stared through the window at the mass of humanity climbing his ship's gangway in the bitter cold and observed the disorder silently. Born and raised in Belgium, he had been employed by the Belgian lines for nearly 25 years. His hair was gray, silver at the temples, and his eyes brown. At age 46, he was withdrawn and quiet and kept to himself. Those officers who had sailed with him on numerous voyages found him difficult to approach, but they all considered him a competent seaman. Limbour studied a message from his radio operator and turned to his chief officer, Robert de Pierpont. "We'll be accompanied by the British troopship Cheshire and a small fleet of American landing craft." De Pierpont asked, "And our escorts?" "1 French and 3 British destroyers. I hope they've notified the Germans there will be no trespassing." Limbour sighed. "No sign of the Luftwaffe since D-Day, and the German E-type torpedo boats only make hit-and-run strikes 200 miles north of here. I doubt if any are operating in this area." And the German E-type torpedo boats only make hit-and-run strikes 200 miles north of here. I doubt if any are operating in this area. Although the Leopoldville had undergone a complete refitting only 8 months before, to the American troops boarding her, she looked tired, old, run down, and dirty. Built in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1929 by John Cockerell and Sons, she went into service for the Royal Belgian Lloyd Lines, transporting cargo and passengers from the Belgian Congo and other ports in Africa to her home harbor of Antwerp, Belgium. After the war broke out, she was refitted in Liverpool from passenger liner to troop transport. During the next 4 years, she carried mostly British troops to and from the Mediterranean. After the invasion of France, she made 24 crossings from England to the beaches of Normandy, landing over 53,000 men. 7 crudely constructed wooden decks with low ceilings and bunks stacked 4 high now filled the cargo holds. The crew numbered 120 Belgians, 93 Congolese, and a British contingent of 34 officers and men who manned the guns and supervised the troop loading and landing. Because of the Christmas holiday, many of the British crew were on leave and didn't make it back to the ship in time for the boarding. As a consequence, no one checked off the units of the 66th Panthers as they trudged on board. By 9 a.m. on Christmas Eve, the transports were finally loaded and ready for the short voyage across the Channel. The troops nestled down in their packed compartments, Most tried to sleep, stomachs grumbling as the soldiers thought wistfully of a breakfast that was never served. Slipping the pier, Leopoldville steamed from Southampton Harbor. In her wake, Cheshire followed like an obedient hound. Both ships were fully loaded. All told, nearly 4,500 troops set out that day for the 9-hour channel crossing. Passing over the anti-submarine nets, the troop transports entered the channel. Steaming through the watery expanse separating the mainland and the Isle of Wight, Leopoldville and her convoy met the destroyer escorts. HMS Brilliant, Anthony, and Hotham, along with the Free French frigate Croix de Lorraine, took up defensive stations around the troop ships. It was business as usual. At 2 p.m., the order was radioed from the destroyer Brilliant for the transports to commence a zigzag course. The first submarine alert came at 2:30. The anti-submarine system aboard Brilliant detected an underwater object. Raising a black flag to signal the troop ships, the destroyers set off to drop depth charges. 15 minutes later, the drill was over. Raising a black flag to signal the troop ships, the destroyers set off to drop depth charges. 15 minutes later, the drill was over. It was written off as a false alarm. But there was to be no relief. A short time later, another contact was made. Once again, the destroyers sprinted ahead of the convoy and dropped depth charges. Whether they found a U-boat or not was never determined. By the time the second submarine alert had ended, the sea was becoming nasty. Waves were running 8 to 9 feet from crest to trough, and the men inside the ships began to suffer. Many became seasick and rushed for the heads. Others vomited where they were. The air inside Leopoldville rapidly became foul. Diesel fuel. The air inside Leopoldville rapidly became foul. Diesel fuel reeked everywhere. Most men sat on their duffel bags or tried to get some rest in the hammocks. They pulled blankets over their overcoats to keep warm. Only a few engaged in conversation or played cards. Spray whipped across the bridge wings of Leopoldville as the next watch filtered up and took their stations. But Captain Limbor remained on the bridge as he usually had during channel crossings since D-Day. 7 hours into the voyage, the wind and sea around the convoy grew to force 6. The 2,235 men on Leopoldville were now only 25 miles north and slightly east of Cherbourg. Although Germany was still building U-boats fast and furiously in the winter of 1944-45, the Allies were sinking them as fast as they left the dock. Oberleutnant Gerhard Meyer did not doubt that his days were numbered. Commander of U-486, Meyer's boat was one of very few submarines that his days were numbered. Commander of U-486, Meyer's boat was one of very few submarines lurking in and around the English Channel. Dropping to the bottom by day and rising only at night, U-486 was constantly harried by hordes of destroyers and sub-hunting aircraft. Having made the long trip from his base in Norway, Meyer would have preferred to be anywhere but in the cold waters off the coast of Normandy this Christmas Eve as he peered through his periscope. The time was 5:45 in the evening. Folding down the etched steel hand controls, Meyer rested his forehead against the eyepiece and stared into the lenses of the periscope. It was dark, with a lingering light reflecting on the clouds to the west. The sea was rough and choppy, goaded by a brisk gale. Rotating the shaft, Meyer looked toward shore, 5 miles away. Inside the protected harbor of Cherbourg, the lights of the town flickered in the gathering night. He swung the viewer back to the open sea, peering through the glooms of the town flickered in the gathering night. He swung the viewer back to the open sea, peering through the gloom toward England. And then he saw something. The outlines of 2 large ships and a pair of destroyers. The shot had to be quick and neat. no chance for a second attempt. Meyer had a healthy respect for the destroyers that he knew would be all over U-486 within a minute after the torpedo launch. "Ready tubes 1 and 2. At 5:56 p.m., Meyer ranged on the largest ship in the convoy. The bow of the submarine moved almost imperceptibly as Meyer lined up the shot. Then he gave the order to fire. "Down periscope and dive! Quickly, quickly! Full speed toward the coast to throw off the dogs!" Meyer did not wait around to observe the destruction of lives caused by his torpedoes. All he knew for certain was that one had missed, but he was pleased when he heard the torpedo that struck home. Deep in the bowels of the ship, most of the soldiers were asleep when the torpedo slammed into number 4 hold, starboard aft. Rivets burst and flew like rifle bullets. Hundreds died without knowing what struck them. Observers on deck swore they saw parts of bodies hurled high in the air. The steel girders supporting the bulkheads buckled. Deck F collapsed into Deck G, taking the stairways with them and preventing escape. Cries of pain and panic were quickly snuffed out by the tremendous surge of water into the hull. Hundreds were engulfed by the pain and panic were quickly snuffed out by the tremendous surge of water into the hull. Hundreds were engulfed by the sea and sudden darkness. Estimates placed those who died instantly at 315. Fewer than 20 men made it to the decks above. Walter Blunt of L Company heard the screams and muffled cries only after his head broke from the water. The swirling debris reeked of oil and gunpowder. He found himself wedged in a hole in the deck above. His head and shoulders protruded into the upper compartment, but he was wedged tight and couldn't struggle free. Waves washed over him as the ship began to sink beneath him, the dirty water rising higher and higher, and causing him to hold his breath until he nearly passed out. He was thinking, "This is a hell of a way to die," when a light beamed on his face, and his company commander, Captain Orr, leaned over him. "Give me your hand, son. You'll be all right." He pulled Blunt free and helped him to the outside deck, where he was placed in the only lifeboat carrying wounded GIs who had survived the explosion. Out of Blunt's 181-man unit, 74 were killed and 61 injured. Walter Brown of Company F owed his life to being seasick. Feeling the effects of the rough seas, he left his compartment and climbed to a head near the outer deck, where he planned to throw up. He had no sooner walked up to a sink than the torpedo hit. Knocked unconscious, he awoke to find water spraying on him from broken overhead pipes. He saved himself by leaping onto the deck of a small ship that came alongside as Leopold began her slide to the bottom. He was the last man to escape the ship without jumping into the water. Only Brown and 5 others survived from Company F. 153 went down with the ship. Escaped the ship without jumping into the water. Only Brown and 5 others survived from Company F. 153 went down with the ship. Staff Sergeant Jerry Crean, Company B, was playing cards when he felt the impact and the ship suddenly slow to a stop. Receiving no instructions, Crean gathered the 12 men of his platoon and led them up to the open decks. He made sure they stuck together while he returned with enough life jackets to outfit them all. At 7 o'clock, an hour after U-486 sent her torpedo into Leopoldville, Crean was told help was on the way. Rescue vessels and tugs were reported to be coming from the nearby harbor to tow them in. But as the ship rolled on a 10-degree list, he realized for the first time that this damn thing is going to sink. Confusion was mixed with calmness as uninjured soldiers of the Panther Division either stood in formation on the open deck waiting for orders, or simply milled around, puzzled about what to do. All they were told was to wait or to make way for the crew. They watched in amusement that soon turned to outright rage as the Congolese crew struggled to lower the lifeboats. There was some cheering as the troops thought the boats were being prepared for them. But then it became apparent the crew were abandoning the ship on their own. One or more boats tipped and spilled its crew into the sea. None of the Congolese made any attempt to rescue their passengers. They soon rowed off, carrying luggage, radios, personal belongings, even a parrot in a cage, leaving no one on the ship who knew how to lower the remaining lifeboats and rafts. Several soldiers were killed or injured in trying to free the boats from their mountings and davits. Many attempted to cut away the ropes holding lifeboats and rafts. Several soldiers were killed or injured in trying to free the boats from their mountings and davits. Many attempted to cut away the ropes holding the many rafts, but did not have knives. The soldiers actually managed to launch a boat, but it was quickly filled by the Leopoldville's crew, while the Americans stood by in disbelief. Throughout the debacle, Captain Limbour did or said nothing. On the bridge he appeared overly calm. Some described him in a state of shock. Normally a strict disciplinarian, he stood mute without making the slightest attempt to display command. Bewilderment seemed to strike the minds of the other ship captains. While the British destroyers rushed about dropping depth charges, the troop ship Cheshire stood by for nearly an hour, less than 200 yards away from Leopoldville. The men on board Cheshire thought they heard a muffled explosion in the distance, and then it appeared to them that the other troop ship was beginning to list. Their ship's officers did not comprehend the horrendous debacle that was taking place before their eyes. They did not have a clue to the growing crisis. The men on Cheshire could only stand and stare through the darkness at the stricken ship, until Cheshire finally turned away and headed into Cherbourg. Only 5 miles from land, Leopoldville still had a chance of being beached if the tow ships arrived soon. But word was not getting through. Everyone was celebrating Christmas Eve, and very few personnel were on duty. All potential rescue boats sat idle, their crews on leave. 30 minutes passed before Convoy Commander John Pringle, captain of HMS Brilliant, signaled Cherbourg, "Taking off survivors. Need assistance." The officers at the harbor entrance control post were startled at the unexpected request. "Survivors of what?" they inquired. "Leopoldville hit. Need assistance." On shore, military bureaucracy reigned supreme. Messages were sent, received, and passed on. Orders were, they inquired. "Leopoldville hit. Need assistance." On shore, military bureaucracy reigned supreme. Messages were sent, received, and passed on. Orders were given, but not relayed. High-ranking officers enjoying Yule parties could not be bothered. Finally, men of decision began to take responsibility for the rescue operation. Men like Lieutenant Colonel Tom McConnell at the harbor entrance. McConnell was a successful Indiana businessman before the war and minced no words in describing the situation to his superiors. He turned the phone lines blue with descriptive language, demanding, pleading, castigating sergeants and generals alike in an attempt to get a rescue operation underway. In no uncertain terms, he notified the general in command of the port that he was taking it on his own authority to send out rescue vessels. By the time McConnell's efforts had sent Army rescue tugs on their way to the sinking ship, 50 minutes had passed. Ensign Nat Duvall, the Navy duty officer, wasn't having much luck until he connected with Lieutenant Commander Richard Davis. When Duvall's call came from the fort, Davis didn't merely cut through red tape, he shredded it. Less than 5 minutes after being notified of Leopoldville's situation, Davis had 2 PT boats racing toward the stricken ship. 2 minutes later, a third left port. He then sent officers into town to pull sailors and soldiers from the bars. Shortly after 7 p.m., Davis had Cherbourg started toward mobilization. Minutes later, the first lifeboats carrying Congolese crewmen arrived at the docks and were questioned. Hospitals were notified, food and beds arranged. The rescue was at last being coordinated. The people on shore began to realize a disaster was in the making. But the soldiers on board Leopoldville still hadn't been warned that the ship was slipping away beneath their feet. In a precise display of skilled seamanship, Commander Pringle took the bull by the horns and brought his destroyer Brilliant alongside Leopoldville. As his ship approached, Pringle's crew threw out mooring lines. With no Belgian crew to catch them, the destroyer's British gunners and sailors leaped aboard Leopoldville and secured Brilliant. The high seas pounded Brilliant's much smaller hull against Leopoldville's larger one. Steel plates buckled and groaned in protest as they scraped together. The sounds were ominous, and Pringle realized he could not remain tethered to the troopship for very long. Soon shouts came from his men to the soldiers on the troopship. "Jump, Yank, jump!" The cold, dark night, the violent sea, the waves plunging and thrusting the little destroyer up and down like a toy boat, made the leap a terrifying undertaking for the young soldiers crowded on the decks of the troopship. It was made all the more appalling by the men who mistimed their jump and missed the destroyer, falling into the water between the two ships before being crushed to death as the surge drove steel plates against steel plates. Terrifying undertaking for the young soldiers crowded on the decks of the troopship. It was made all the more appalling by the men who mistimed their jump and missed the destroyer, falling into the water between the two ships before being crushed to death as the surge drove steel plates against steel plates. By 7:20, HMS Brilliant had managed to take aboard almost 700 soldiers of the 66th. The other destroyers of the convoy, Hotham, Anthony, and Croix de Lorraine, had given up the hunt for the U-boat and headed for port. With no damage reports coming from Leopoldville, they were still unaware the troopship was in danger of sinking. Pringle was growing more concerned for his ship. The constant impact caused by the turbulent sea had loosened the steel plates of Brilliant's hull. From below decks, his engineering officer reported the pumps were keeping up with the sudden flood of water, but the flow was increasing. His radio man reported that he picked up signals from PT boats and rescue tugs that were rushing to the scene. Pringle shouted to the officer directing the evacuation on the open deck. "Sever the lines holding us to Leo." Bob Hesse, the platoon sergeant from New York, along with a handful of his men, edged across the forward pan of the troopship until they reached the anchor chain on the forecastle. Someone from the British destroyer yelled at them. "We're cutting off, Yanks! You better jump now! It'll be your last chance!" To Hesse, it looked as if 2/3 of Leopoldville was already underwater. The bow had risen until they thought they were in the clouds. Hesse looked at his men. "Let's go! Every man for himself!" They all stood on the railing, waiting for Brilliant to rise within jumping distance for what was perhaps the last time. As the smaller ship lifted on the next wave, they jumped together, all 6 of them. To Hesse, it seemed like he was leaping off the Empire State Building. Every man landed safely. British sailors, armed with axes, cut away the lines, and Brilliant backed away from Leopoldville and headed for Cherbourg. The big rescue tug ATR-3 arrived and pulled along the opposite side of the doomed troopship. Skipper Stanley Lewandowski was cussing up a storm at the waves already closing over the stern of Leopoldville. He was damned mad. U-tug ATR-3 arrived and pulled along the opposite side of the doomed troopship. Skipper Stanley Lewandowski was cussing up a storm at the waves already closing over the stern of Leopoldville. He was damned mad. Twice he had attempted to maneuver alongside before the ship sank, but was stopped by the davits of the lifeboats that hung out and down. Had the Belgian crew remained a few minutes more and loaded the lifeboats properly, the davits would have been retracted, and Lewandowski could have pulled his boat abreast of the railing. He had been equally frustrated by a group of 200 men standing at attention on the bow. Entreaties for them to jump aboard went ignored. Later, as he pulled them from the water, he was told an officer wouldn't allow them to jump. Now the Belgian ship was disappearing before his eyes. As he clutched the spokes of the helm and threaded his massive tug into the sea of heads floating in the wreckage, he shouted to his crew, "Pull them poor kids aboard!" 3 of his crew jumped overboard to help heave exhausted and freezing soldiers onto the deck of the tug. Within the hull of Leopoldville, the cold water reached and burst her boilers. Creaking and groaning, the bow lifted in the air and began a downward spiral as the ship began her final journey to the seabed. Bodies were seen to fall like leaves from her open decks. At 8:30 p.m., with a mighty hiss of escaping steam, the troop ship vanished stern first under the black water and was seen no more. Many were sucked down with the Leopoldville, including Captain Limbor, whose body was never found. It was estimated that over 1,000 men were left floating in water with the temperature as low as 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Panic set in as the men struggled to stay alive. Men who couldn't swim seized those who could and dragged them under. It was as if a crowd at a football game gave out a great roar. Hundreds of men were shouting, crying, begging for help from God. Many pleaded for their mothers. Some cursed any and everyone responsible for their plight. A great number simply gave up and died by drowning or from exposure. Vince Codiani of Company K was one of several men who were trapped under a glass passenger shelter as the ship for their plight. A great number simply gave up and died by drowning or from exposure. Vince Codiani of Company K was one of several men who were trapped under a glass passenger shelter as the ship lurched to port and began her plunge. Codiani was pulled under when his clothing caught on part of the glass shelter. A strong swimmer, he struggled free and gained the surface, but not without injury. His front teeth had been knocked out, his tongue slit in two, and his neck and arms badly gashed by shattered glass. Incredibly, Codiani survived 2 hours in the frigid water, his clothes frozen to his body, listening to cries of help, before they finally faded into the night. He was found and pulled from the sea, more dead than alive, by a French tug. Private Edwin Phillips, Headquarters Company, was pulled from the water and laid on the deck of a Navy minesweeper. Thinking he was dead, a crewman gave him a nudge with his foot. "You can't be alive." "I am too." "That's good. We're not supposed to pick up dead bodies." Phillips went on to live a long and healthy life. The crews of the tugboats, Coast Guard corvettes, and French fishing boats worked like madmen to pick up the mass of men. The crews of the tugboats, Coast Guard corvettes, and French fishing boats worked like madmen to pick up the mass of men fighting cold and waves and death. Skipper Stanley Lewandowski kept his tug on station. His men took on 70 survivors before the cries in the night faded, and he reluctantly turned his boat back to the harbor. The first boats to arrive in Cherbourg with survivors carried a few of the dead. The boats that returned later carried many more. Over 1,400 men were rescued. Approximately 300 died in the blast from the torpedo, while 500 died later in the water. The official death toll stands at 802. Until her final voyage, Leopoldville transported 124,240 soldiers safely through dangerous waters to their destination. Only the battleship Arizona, sunk during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, lost more men than Leopoldville. It was a tragedy compounded by fate, miscalculation, blunders, and ignorance. If the evacuation of the ship had been carried out properly, hundreds of families would not have received telegrams notifying them of the loss of their loved ones. The official investigations were varied but limited. Those back home were told only that their sons or husbands had died or were missing in action. Leopoldville was swept under the carpet, and the sinking buried in official files. The submarine that set the stage for the terrible tragedy, U-486, was herself sunk by the British submarine Tapir 4 months later. Oberleutnant Gerhard Meyer and his entire crew perished.
In 1984, a 6-week Numa expedition was divided into 2 phases. The first 3 weeks were to be spent searching for World War I ships and U-boats, and the second phase of 3 weeks was dedicated to find the World War II troop transport Leopoldville and the famed Confederate raider Alabama, which went down off France after a furious battle with Union frigate Kearsarge. Nearly 2 years of research went into the effort. Bill Shea of Brandeis University met me in Aberdeen, Scotland, where I had charted Arvor III, a solid, tough yacht built in Buckle, Scotland, sometime in the 1960s. Powered by 2 big diesels, she cruised at a complacent 8 knots. She was ideally suited as a search and survey vessel. Solid and stable as a work platform, her living quarters were comfortable and efficient. Her main salon and staterooms were paneled in deep red mahogany and quite large. Besides a commode, the head in the main stateroom provided a bidet. The first time I tried it, I turned the handle too far and reversed my anal canal while striking my head on the deck above. I was blessed to get Arvor III, and I was doubly blessed with her remarkable crew. Arvor's skipper, Jimmy Flett, is a Scot any man would be proud to boast of having as a friend. After 3 weeks, we put in at the fishing port of Bridlington on the Yorkshire coast, where we met up with Numa President Wayne Grunquist. Sometimes it's hard to separate reality from comic relief. Despite the best-laid plans of Mice and Cussler, on the deck above. I was blessed to get Arvor III, and I was doubly blessed with her remarkable crew. Arvor's skipper, Jimmy Flett, is a Scot any man would be proud to boast of having as a friend. After 3 weeks, we put in at the fishing port of Bridlington on the Yorkshire coast, where we met up with Numa President Wayne Grunquist. Sometimes it's hard to separate reality from comic relief. Despite the best-laid plans of Mice and Cussler, the second phase of the '84 North Sea expedition was like a comic opera, produced and staged by inmates from a mental institution. If I'd known the fiasco the Numa crew of Arvor III was about to encounter in Cherbourg, I would have ordered Jimmy Flett to keep right on going and steer a course for the harbor at Monte Carlo. On the day we departed, as we left the North Sea and passed through the Straits of Dover into the English Channel, Bill Shea, who gets terrible motion sickness, was in seventh heaven. The sea was a pond. No waves rocked Arvor III. After the cliffs above Cherbourg came into view, we slipped into the harbor past the breakwater, the old fort, and monstrous oil rigs on their way to the North Sea. Jimmy had radioed ahead for a berth in the yacht basin, and we tied up not far from a nice hotel with a gourmet dining room. During innocent conversation with the dockmaster, we mentioned that we had come to Cherbourg to search for the Confederate raider, Alabama. Inquiring as to when we were to launch the search, he was told the next day. When the time came to make the effort, we never left the dock. 6 uniformed custom agents, red pillbox hats perched on their greasy heads, came aboard first thing in the morning and proceeded to tear the boat apart while asking a multitude of foolish questions. They pried open every cabinet, probed every suitcase, every box and container, large and small. They went through the engine room with dental mirrors, searching behind every pipe and manifold. Nothing went unprobed. I half expected a demand for a strip search. They questioned the purpose of the side-scan sonar, the magnetometer, and video equipment, wanting to know every detail of our operation. Finally, after they were satisfied we were not carrying a nuclear bomb, the head honcho, who looked like a cross between Inspector Clouseau and Ace Ventura with a mustache, asked me the purpose of our visit to France. With nothing to hide, I guilelessly told him the engine room with dental mirrors, searching behind every pipe and manifold. Nothing went unprobed. I half expected a demand for a strip search. They questioned the purpose of the side-scan sonar, the magnetometer, and video equipment, wanting to know every detail of our operation. Finally, after they were satisfied we were not carrying a nuclear bomb, the head honcho, who looked like a cross between Inspector Clouseau and Ace Ventura with a mustache, asked me the purpose of our visit to France. With nothing to hide, I guilelessly told him we were hunting for the wreck of the Confederate raider Alabama. I was then informed in no uncertain terms that we could not search in French waters without permission from the commander of the local French naval district. Deploying our forces, we counterattacked. Wayne Grunquist, who was from Austin, Texas, donned his cowboy boots and custom-made cowboy hat, settled his watch and chain in the pockets of his vest, and assaulted the offices of the admiral commanding the Cherbourg Naval District. After sizing up Grunquist in his Texas attorney attire, the French admiral politely suggested that the Texan and his friends take the next stagecoach out of Cherbourg. In the meantime, I was swept up in an orgy of dramatic grandeur by holding press conferences and calling every bigwig I knew in Washington. Now the harassment began on all flanks. Odd as it sounds, we rather enjoyed it. When Arvor III was moored to the dock in the yacht basin, Cherbourg. In the meantime, I was swept up in an orgy of dramatic grandeur by holding press conferences and calling every bigwig I knew in Washington. Now the harassment began on all flanks. Odd as it sounds, we rather enjoyed it. When Arvor III was moored to the dock in the yacht basin, helicopters flew over the boat while cameramen leaned out and shot overhead pictures of us sunbathing on the deck. We also took great delight in sneaking up on people sitting in cars or crouching behind seawalls, observing the boat and crew through binoculars. One evening, after dinner, Jimmy Flatt and I were sitting on the deck enjoying brandy and cigars when he noticed bubbles in the water illuminated by the lights along the quay. Walking inside the cabin, we alerted Bill, who turned on the video equipment. We then carefully lowered the underwater video camera over the side. In great anticipation, the entire crew stared at the video monitor as Bill popped on the lights attached to the camera. Suddenly, the startled faces of two French Navy frogmen, their eyes bugging through the lenses of their underwater face masks, burst on the screen. An instant later, they stroked into blackness and were gone. What in the hell was going on, we all wondered. Suddenly, the startled faces of two French Navy frogmen, their eyes bugging through the lenses of their underwater face masks, burst on the screen. An instant later, they stroked into blackness and were gone. What in the hell was going on, we all wondered. Why were we being treated like spies? In Washington, NUMA's chief director, Admiral Bill Thompson, former Naval Chief of Public Information, hit on every officer he knew in the French Navy, rallied the Pentagon, and hit on every officer he knew in the French Navy, rallied the Pentagon, and pestered the White House. Things became so confused that the French embassy sent a message to our State Department saying, "We apologize for this incident." The State Department, in total ignorance of our predicament, replied, "We apologize too." According to my literary agent in Paris, I became the darling of the French press with my ranting and raving. Some pretty high officials in the French government regretted our situation but said there was nothing they could do. After 2 weeks of futile combat, I struck our flag. I felt there was nothing more to be accomplished. The French admiral refused to capitulate. I turned over my records, charts, and projections to I struck our flag. I felt there was nothing more to be accomplished. The French admiral refused to capitulate. I turned over my records, charts, and projections to a French schoolteacher who had acted as our translator rather than carry them back to Colorado with me on the airplane. He agreed to keep them safe until my return. I was sure we would get the mess ironed out during the coming months and come back with a permit in hand the following summer. Short of mooning the customs officials as we departed Cherbourg Harbor, I could not stop myself from firing the last shot. Since a side-scan search for Alabama involved a fairly extensive grid, I could not risk that attempt, knowing the French Navy would be all over us before lunch. But I figured that finding a ship the size of Leopoldville within a short time was far from impossible. Paying our dock fees and casting off, we set sail for her grave early one morning before the sun came up. The trick was to find Leopoldville, identify it, then beat it out of French waters to Britain. Our one advantage was that Wayne and I had requested permission to search only for Alabama. We never mentioned Leopoldville. Since Arvor III was heading away from the Confederate raiders' final resting place with our course set west toward Weymouth, England, I hoped it would appear to the French officials that we had given up and were leaving Cherbourg in our wake for good. We had a location for the shipwreck from the British Admiralty, and I decided to take the position as gospel and work from there. Because we were hunting for an object nearly 500 feet in length and 62 feet wide, I gambled on using only our boat's built-in echo sounder. This meant we had to go almost directly over Leopoldville in order to record its hulk. An hour and 20 minutes into the chase, a location for the shipwreck from the British Admiralty, and I decided to take the position as gospel and work from there. Because we were hunting for an object nearly 500 feet in length and 62 feet wide, I gambled on using only our boat's built-in echo sounder. This meant we had to go almost directly over Leopoldville in order to record its hulk. An hour and 20 minutes into the chase, the echo sounder recorded an anomaly rising 60 feet off the bottom. It was a lucky hit. 2 more passes confirmed a huge, long object pointed toward Cherbourg, but on a slight angle, no doubt caused by current swinging the Leopoldville on her anchor before she sank. She lies just 300 meters northwest of the recorded position. I regretted that we had no wreath to drop over the side, nor a ceremony prepared. Though the sun was shining brightly, it didn't take great imagination to picture that night of horror. We slowly circled the wreck, watching its mass rise from the bottom on the echo sounder. It was a heart-rending moment, but we knew the French Navy would not allow us to hang around. We all kept one eye aimed on the entrance to Cherbourg Harbor. "Be nice to see more of her," said Jimmy. "No peeky, no findy," said him on the echo sounder. It was a heart-rending moment, but we knew the French Navy would not allow us to hang around. We all kept one eye aimed on the entrance to Cherbourg Harbor. "Be nice to see more of her," said Jimmy. "No peeky, no findy," said Bill. "I'm easy." Over went the sensor, on went the power to the side scan. Clickety-clack went the recorder. "Will the boat 5 miles north of Cherbourg please return to port immediately?" came a voice in perfect English over the radio. I looked at Jimmy. "How far to British waters?" "About 18 miles. "What do you think, Skipper?" Jimmy Flett is a man among men. He smiled slyly, reached up, and turned off the radio. I nodded. All right, that concludes the entertainment part of the program. Let's get the hell out of here. With Jimmy grimly gripping the spokes of the wheel, his eyes set toward England, the rest of us stood on the stern and watched for French patrols. Get the hell out of here. With Jimmy grimly gripping the spokes of the wheel, his eyes set toward England, the rest of us stood on the stern and watched for French patrol boats or helicopters to come chasing after us. I was certainly in no position to endanger lives on board Arvor 3 by putting up any resistance. Except for a grappling hook and a couple of Swiss Army knives, our only other arsenal of weapons was an incredible bounty of small, boiling potatoes. Down deep, I didn't think even the French Navy would attack a British boat flying the Royal Yacht Club ensign with 4 virtuous Americans on board. As Arvor 3 was entering the harbor of Weymouth, we passed a French Navy missile frigate coming out that was participating in NATO exercises. "How close can you shave him, Jimmy?" I asked. 30 feet be okay?" 30 feet will do just fine." To the French sailors roaming the decks of the missile frigate, Arvor 3 simply looked like another fishing boat coming into port. They hardly gave a second look as we lined up on the stern deck. The stunned expression on their faces was like a narcotic to me as our barrage of boiling potatoes struck, burst, and sprayed over men and ship alike. Another fishing boat coming into port. They hardly gave a second look as we lined up on the stern deck. The stunned expression on their faces was like a narcotic to me as our barrage of boiling potatoes struck, burst, and sprayed over men and ship alike. They never knew what hit them. They didn't know why, and I guess they never will. We were in friendly waters now, and all they could do was shake their fists and shout awful things at us in French. As shipwreck expeditions go, shake their fists and shout awful things at us in French. As shipwreck expeditions go, the 84 expedition possessed the fondest memories. Much had been accomplished. Our only failure was not being allowed to hunt for Alabama. I laid over in New York and held a news conference on board the aircraft carrier Intrepid to announce our finds. I especially wanted to tell the tragic story of the Leopoldville and its sinking on Christmas Eve of 1944. It seems strange that so few people were aware of the disaster and staggering loss of life. We gave it our best shot and put Leopoldville on the 6 o'clock TV news shows and in every major newspaper in the country. Suddenly, families who had simply received a telegram soon after the sinking, saying only that their loved one was killed in action, now began to ask questions. It warmed our hearts to be instrumental in steering a number of wives, brothers, sisters, and survivors to the Panther Veteran Organization, made up of men who had served with the 66th Division. The final act of the Cherbourg incident, however, was far from over. The French were full of surprises. Shortly after I returned to my home in Colorado, to the Panther Veteran Organization, made up of men who had served with the 66th Division. The final act of the Cherbourg incident, however, was far from over. The French were full of surprises. Shortly after I returned to my home in Colorado, I read of the dastardly slap in the face given me by the French Navy. One of their salvage ships had launched a search 2 weeks after we made our great escape from Cherbourg, and guess what? They found Alabama. They claimed to have searched for 20 years, discovering the wreck site only after new research material was brought to their attention. Mine. Coincidentally, the cousin of the salvage ship commander happened to be the schoolteacher with whom I left all my research material and my estimated position for Alabama. The schmoes. Not only were they proud of it, they were smug about it. I underwent a total personality change and was suddenly taken sober. The schmoes. Not only were they proud of it, they were smug about it. I underwent a total personality change and was suddenly taken sober. The French Navy must have held a grudge against Newmer for pelting its missile cruiser with potatoes. Could discovering the remains of Alabama have been their way of getting even? In the final analysis, I'd have to say we'd been had. My involvement with the French Navy and the Alabama died hard. Several months later, I received a telephone call from a gentleman claiming to be a deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. What could the CIA possibly want with me? I wondered. Dirk Pitt occasionally walked the hallowed halls of Langley, but I'd never laid eyes on the place. "What is this call about?" I asked, firm in my belief that I was as pristine and white as the driven snow. "Your glittering performance in Cherbourg last summer," he said. "All right, so I got a little carried away with the potato war." The potato war? "Isn't this a call about my assault on a French missile cruiser?" I hadn't heard about that one," he replied. Forget I mentioned it. My boss, who is a big fan of your books, suggested I call and brief you on the mess you caused." Now I was really intrigued. If that rotten French admiral had given me permission to look for the Alabama, there would have been no mess. "Believe me, the admiral wasn't too happy about your clandestine find of the Leopoldville. A good thing you took off for England. If you had returned to Cherbourg, French security forces waiting on the dock would have confiscated your boat and locked you in to look for the Alabama. There would have been no mess. Believe me, the admiral wasn't too happy about your clandestine find of the Leopoldville. A good thing you took off for England. If you had returned to Cherbourg, French security forces waiting on the dock would have confiscated your boat and locked you and your crew up in the local slammer." "Oh, no big deal," I said. "Hardly cause for an international incident." "Did you know that the waters around Cherbourg are submarine testing grounds?" "Yes, I was aware of the areas. They're well marked on the navigation charts." "What you could not have known, Mr. Cussler, is the French had just completed their newest nuclear submarine and planned to test it shortly after your arrival." "If I had known, I couldn't have cared less," I said. "What you were also not aware of was the fact that every intelligence office and agency in a dozen different nations, the CIA, the KGB, the British M5, the Israeli Mossad, to name a few, spent great sums of money and long hours in setting up their individual covers to covertly observe the French nuclear submarines test program. A few days before the trials were to take place," he continued, "who should sail into Cherbourg Harbor but Clive Cussler, his merry band of pirates, and a boatload of underwater detection equipment?" It all became clear. Now I felt a kinship to a woolly mammoth that sank in the La Brea tar pits. "Not knowing what to make of your theatrical appearance, the French Navy got cold feet and postponed the tests of their new submarine for 6 months. All the foreign intelligence undercover operations were then blown away. There was no way for any of us to sit it out for another half year, so we all packed up and went home. I failed my country. Not your fault," he consoled me. "But the agency would like you to do us a big favor." Off in the distance, I heard a band playing the Stars and Stripes Forever. Redemption was about to smile. You have but to name it." The next time you and your Numa crew plan a shipwreck expedition, would you please notify our office at Langley of where you're going so we can operate on the other side of the world? I was too numb with shock to reply. I had no idea representatives of the Central Intelligence, but the agency would like you to do us a big favor. Off in the distance, I heard a band playing the Stars and Stripes Forever. Redemption was about to smile. You have but to name it. The next time you and your Numa crew plan a shipwreck expedition, would you please notify our office at Langley of where you're going so we can operate on the other side of the world? I was too numb with shock to reply. I had no idea representatives of the Central Intelligence Agency did stand-up comedy. Finally, I muttered, "I'll drop you a postcard." Then he politely said, "Thank you, goodbye," and hung up. And so ended the great Numa Follies of 1984.
The Lost Locomotive of Kiowa Creek. In May of 1878, the bustle of activity in the rail yard of the Kansas Pacific Railroad in Denver, Colorado, gave no indication that a disaster was impending. Colorado had become a state 2 years earlier, and Denver was rapidly growing in regional importance. Trains from the east, bearing the fruits of eastern industry, rolled into the yard several times a day. There, goods were unloaded and some reloaded for the trip to California, onto trains with extra locomotives for the climb over the Rocky Mountains. This evening, except for a downpour from a storm that never seemed to pass, it was business as usual. The heavy rain had been falling hard for days, and half the city became flooded when Cherry Creek and the Platte River overflowed. The record-setting deluge was unusual for May, but Colorado's climate was notorious for changing from sunny warmth to 3 feet of snow within 24 hours. The record-setting deluge was unusual for May, but Colorado's climate was notorious for changing from sunny warmth to 3 feet of snow within 24 hours. The only thing that could be safely said about the Rocky Mountain State's weather was its guarantee of unpredictability. Walking from his home on 32nd Street, Kansas Pacific Railroad engineer John Bacon crossed the bridge over the South Platte River. The river was swollen and muddy from the rains. A strong breeze bore the smell of fresh mud and coal smoke from the rail yard. Continuing across the bridge, he walked down a dirty alley, then stepped over 4 sets of track rails toward the dispatch office. Inside the office, Bacon nodded to Chester Tubbs, a stout man built like Friar Tuck, who was alongside a standing desk, and he made his way to the pot-bellied stove with the blue enameled coffee pot. He saw that Tubbs was marking a railroad scheduling chart. Tubbs spoke without looking up. "Wet enough for you, John?" "Come August, Chester, we'll be glad we had this downpour. The farmers out on the eastern plains don't mind it at all." Tubbs shifted from one leg to the other, held up his chart, and pointed with the pencil. "You'll be running train number 8 to Kansas City." "What's the cargo?" "Scrap railroad iron." "What engine did you assign me?" "Number 51, 25 cars and a caboose." Bacon mentally estimated the approximate weight of 25 freight cars loaded with heavy scrap rail iron, pulled by a locomotive driving over wet rails. "It's a downgrade from here to Kansas. I should have no trouble keeping your schedule, so long as the storm doesn't follow us across the plains. Did you crew me with my brother-in-law, Frank Selden?" Tubbs nodded. "I also scheduled your poker pal, George Piatt, as you bow us across the plains. Did you crew me with my brother-in-law, Frank Selden?" Tubbs nodded. "I also scheduled your poker pal, George Piatt, as your brakeman." "You're a good man, Chester. When my crew arrives, tell them I'll be on number 51. Not much later that evening, Frank Selden and George Piatt walked the tracks from the dispatch office together. A brass lantern flickered inside the cab of engine number 51, and a wisp of smoke curled from the locomotive's tall diamond-topped smokestack. As the men climbed the ladder to the cab, they heard the heavy boiler door being slammed. Selden saw John Bacon and grinned. "The engineer doing a fireman's work?" "Somebody's got to put fire in the beast so we can make our schedule. Is Piatt with you?" The answer came with the sound of a pair of size 13 boots clumping onto the cab's iron floor as George Piatt climbed inside. Piatt was muscular but badly overweight in the wrong places. His arms were the size of most men's legs, thick and bulky. Each of the cars in the train had a manual brake, and Piatt's job was to engage the brakes when necessary. The brake wheels did not turn easily, but Piatt's great strength gave him a distinct advantage. Selden grabbed a shovel and began banking the fire inside the furnace. But Piatt's great strength gave him a distinct advantage. Selden grabbed a shovel and began banking the fire inside the furnace. 15 minutes later, after they hooked the engine to the coupled rail cars, Bacon gently eased the throttle arm open. When the couplings took up the slack, he gave a sudden pull on the throttle, sending a burst of steam to the piston and spinning the big drive wheels to heave forward the great weight behind engine number 51. Chugging slowly at first, train number 8 to Kansas City crept from the railroad yard in Denver. The Baldwin-built Mogul-class 460 locomotive was the workhorse of the nation's railroads. With 4 wheels on a pivoting truck at the front and 6 54-inch drive wheels, she was considered a monster for her time, able to pull a long string of heavily laden freight cars up long grades over the mountains. This trip, though, called for her immense power to transport the ponderous load of scrap iron to the smelters in the east. Immense power to transport the ponderous load of scrap iron to the smelters in the east. Black paint covered most of her metal, now glistening under a film of water. Thin hand-painted red striping outlined the rims of her wheels, the cab's window frames, and hand railings above the drive wheels. The cowcatcher, never designed to catch wandering open-range steers, but to scoop their dead carcasses off to the side, jutted ahead of the engine just above the rails. Forward of the tall smokestack sat a great headlight, whose kerosene lamp and mirrored reflectors cast a wide beam into the dark night. Bacon braved the rain and leaned out the side window as the engine passed over Steel Street and the outskirts of the city toward the great flatlands stretching from the Rockies to the Mississippi River. Train number 8 was now gathering speed, steaming on her monotonous eastward run across a landscape devoid of trees and shrubs. 50 miles down track, a wall of surging water smashed into Bridge 607.80. Slamming into the bridge supports, wooden pilings driven 8 feet deep into the stream bed, the churning water snapped them into huge slivers and washed them away, tossing them crazily about like straw in a hurricane. The iron rails atop the bridge swayed without their supports, but remained suspended, creating an illusion of safe passage. Jesse Dillop was lying in a scooped-out hole in a grove of cottonwoods that were alongside the swollen stream below the Kansas Pacific tracks. He clutched a tattered and drenched wool blanket around his shoulders. His few meager belongings were bundled in a haversack at his feet. He sneezed and rose from his muddy shelter. Dillop was on his way from Texas to California, catching rides in empty freight cars. There was work in California, or so he heard. His journey was built on the hope his luck would finally change. The hole, its bottom now a deep puddle, was no longer habitable, and the stream was rising toward his shelter at an alarming rate. So he decided to wander further west in hope of finding a more comfortable place on higher ground to spend this ungodly night. Climbing quickly up the grade to the ballast stones under the ties and rails, he paused when he reached the tracks and, out of habit, peered back through the rain for an approaching train. Instead of a locomotive, he saw the lightning illuminate the shattered remains of the bridge. The iron rails hung suspended in the air above the torrent of rushing water. As he watched, the huge trunk of a cottonwood tree smashed into the eastern base of the bridge and ripped loose the last of the supports. The wooden skeleton that gave the bridge its strength was now completely gone. Dillop raced along the track toward the nearby town of Kiowa Crossing, intent on warning the station master. Slipping on the wet ties, he fell and gashed his knee on a spike. Wrapping a rag from his pocket around the wound, he continued stumbling west over the track. A trail of cinders, sparks, and thick smoke spewed from the stack of engine number 51 as it raced eastward toward the bridge. Frank Selden kept the furnace blazing and the boiler at full steam, while Bacon kept a close eye on the gauges. The rain had diminished a bit, slightly increasing his range of vision under the spewed from the stack of engine number 51 as it raced eastward toward the bridge. Frank Selden kept the furnace blazing and the boiler at full steam, while Bacon kept a close eye on the gauges. The rain had diminished a bit, slightly increasing his range of vision under the headlight. He pulled the throttle another notch as he sent the locomotive thundering over the wet rails. Toward the center of the train, George Piot moved from car to car, checking the brake settings and making sure the backup ratchets functioned properly. Safe from the storm, inside the station house at Kiowa Crossing, less than a mile from the bridge over the creek, Abner Capp was dealing a round of cards on a table, playing 4 hands by himself. The big Seth Thomas clock on one wall read 2 minutes to midnight. The interior of the small wooden station house was comfortably warm. He shuddered at the thought of stepping outside into the damp gloom. Still, the schedule of trains was specific, and Cap had to be standing by the tracks as train number 8 traveled through in case any mail or company instructions were extended off the train by a conductor with a stick, to be caught by him in a small handheld net. Cap wasn't aware that this night, train number 8 was not carrying a conductor. He was slipping on his overcoat when Jesse Dillop burst through the door, looking like a drowned rat. "The bridge is out!" Cap stared at the bedraggled traveler. Dillop's hair hung in wet ringlets and was plastered against a face badly in need of a shave. His clothes were tattered and old, and his pants were torn and bloody where he'd cut his knee. "Have you been drinking?" No, by God, I'm telling you, the bridge east of here has been washed out by floodwaters. The rails hang over the track with nothing under them. The supports are gone. 2 short miles to the west, they heard engine number 51's whistle break the splattering sound of rain on the station roof. Less than 4 minutes running time from the little town of Kiowa Crossing, the freight train raced east toward the bridge that no longer existed. Selden sat back in his small metal seat, resting after stoking the furnace into an inferno. Bacon partially tilted his face around the window frame and peered through one eye, trying to pierce the watery darkness ahead. 7 cars back, George Piott adjusted a dragging brake and then began to make his way forward to the locomotive for a few moments of warmth and a short chat with Bacon and Selden. 25 flat cars, each loaded with 20,000 pounds of scrap iron, gathered momentum on the slight downgrade that ran east toward the Colorado-Kansas border. Cap tossed a spare raincoat to Dillip and handed him a brass lantern with a red glass lens. Then he motioned toward the bridge. "You go east toward the bridge and hang this light on the post alongside the tracks. Sure you don't want me to head west to warn the train? I'll take care of that chore. You've got an injured leg. I'll make faster time than you. Go now." Cap moved faster than Dillip, post alongside the tracks. "Sure you don't want me to head west to warn the train? I'll take care of that chore. You've got an injured leg. I'll make faster time than you. Go now." Cap moved faster than Dillip, but he had further to go. He did not reach the eastern warning light pole before the train was upon him. He waved the red lantern frantically high over his head, praying the engineer would see it. But at that instant, Bacon had turned his attention from the track ahead to check on the gauges. Cap and his frenzied signaling were unseen. His panic mushrooming, Cap hurled the lantern against the side of the cab. But he misjudged the speed of train number 8 and threw too late. The lantern smashed against the wall of the coal tender behind the locomotive cab and went unnoticed. Dillip limped down the tracks as fast as his injured leg could take him. Reaching the eastern signal pole, he climbed the ladder and hooked the lantern in place high above the track. Then he lowered himself to the ground beside the pole just as the light from the Baldwin locomotive transfixed his body in its glare. John Bacon spotted Dillip and the red lantern. He jerked the steam whistle cord. Still not knowing the reason for the stop signal, Bacon fervently hoped George Piott was in position to engage the brake. Still not knowing the reason for the stop signal, Bacon fervently hoped George Piott was in position to engage the brakes. He shoved the throttle closed and pulled the Johnson bar to set the locomotive for reverse. Then he yanked open the throttle again, sending the big drive wheels rotating madly backwards. He shouted to Selden, "They gave us a red light outside of Kiowa Crossing. The Kiowa Creek Bridge must be washed out." "Has to be. I can't think of another reason to flag down a freight train on a night like this." Piott was only 2 cars back when he heard the twin screams of the whistle. Without hesitation, he spun the wheel on the freight car that locked the front brakes. Then he leaped across the scrap rails stacked on the flat car and raced to the rear brake before engaging it as well. Then it was on to the next car, where he repeated the procedure. From the cab, Bacon saw the locomotive's light beam reflected on the rails ahead. "I think we're okay." Selden leaned out the opposite window of the cab. "Looks like the bridge still stands." With the brakes of 3 cars locked by Piott, whistle screeching, drive wheels spinning in reverse, train number 8 was slowing as it traveled down the raised track bed coming out of Kiowa Crossing. But it was far from stopping as it rolled across the unsupported rails. The train's great momentum carried it nearly midway across the mad sweep of floodwater before the twin strands of iron broke and contorted under the weight of 100 tons of heavy metal. Twisting like a dying serpent, the locomotive and 18 broke and contorted under the weight of 100 tons of heavy metal. Twisting like a dying serpent, The locomotive and 18 of the 25 cars rolled into the raging water, where they were flipped end over end by the flood into one entangled mass of wreckage. Debris and rails were ripped off the flatbed cars and shoved downstream as if shot from a cannon. Bacon, Selden, and Piatt died almost instantly, their bodies pummeled and swept downstream. From his position on the tracks above Kiowa Creek, Jesse Dillop stood in mute horror as he watched the big headlight of engine number 51 plunge beneath the water, still glowing for a few seconds until the front lens was smashed and the swirling water extinguished it. 7 of the flat cars and the caboose remained on the tracks as a grim reminder of the tragedy. In shock and unable to stand, Dillop sagged to a sitting position, rain spattering his face. Abner Capp came running up. He stopped beside Dillop and gazed at the... Abner Capp came running up. He stopped beside Dillop and gazed at the black swirling water, the wreckage, and the great empty gap in the middle of the bridge. "Did you see anybody?" Dillop shook his head. "Not a soul. They must all be drowned." "The locomotive?" "Went straight in with its headlights still shining." "Whereabouts?" Dillop pointed north of where the bridge once stood. "Almost to the center of the stream, over near that grove of cottonwoods." Cap nodded solemnly, the shock of the disaster sinking into his soul. "I'm going back to the station house and telegraph the company. You best come home with me. The missus will put a good warm meal in your stomach and you can stay over until the storm lets up." Together, the stunned men turned their backs on the disaster and walked slowly through the rainy night back to Kiowa Crossing. After the sorry news was telegraphed by Cap to the Kansas Pacific offices in Denver, a train was dispatched with investigators and men to search for the bodies. The morning sun rose into a sky clear of rain clouds. Overnight, as if the flood had been an apparition, the murderous waters subsided until they were flowing calmly no more than 4 feet deep. The force of the flood surge was evident by the uprooted cottonwood trees half buried in the creek bed. All that was left of the bridge span was 1 or 2 rails that protruded from the water. They had been twisted and corkscrewed by the weight of the locomotive as it spiraled into the rampage. The thick wooden pilings and their trusses that once formed the bridge supports were nowhere to be seen. 7 of the cars that had fallen into the creek were still partially visible 50 feet north from the former bridge. Bits and pieces of their beds and trucks protruded from the mud and quicksand. Engine number 8, its tender, and the remaining 11 cars had completely disappeared. After studying the situation for an hour, Kansas Pacific Superintendent Colonel C.W. Fisher put his hand on Cap's shoulder and pointed downstream. "Did you arrange for local help in hunting for the bodies of our men?" Cap nodded. 12 ranch hands are ready to leave at your command. Tell them they can begin the search and telegraph my office in Denver. I want a pile driver and a rail car mounted with a crane to set new pilings and lay rails. This railroad is the lifeline to the west. It must be reopened quickly. That day, Frank Selden's body was the first to be found, 1.5 miles downstream. Later that day, a group of ranchers found George Piatt. His big body was badly beaten by his death ride. He was recovered 3 miles downstream. 6 days after the wreck, engineer John Bacon was finally located. He had been carried 7 miles below the shattered bridge. His body was stuck in the limbs of a cottonwood tree 12 feet high. The distance from the ground had kept the coyotes away, but the birds had visited and pecked. Bacon's face was unmercifully disfigured, and he was buried in a closed casket. In honor of the dead, a 30-day period of mourning was declared by the Railroad Engineers Union. Bacon and Selden had been married to sisters with the maiden name of Bennett. The town of Kiowa Crossing was renamed Bennett in honor of the widowed sisters. Working around the clock, Fisher's track crews had the temporary spur open for traffic less than 50 hours later. The railroad company decided it was time to locate the missing locomotive and salvage the cars. Recovery efforts were concentrated around the few cars that were still visible a short distance from the washed-out bridge. Cribbing was driven into the sand to prevent the soft walls from collapsing. Then salvage men began excavating. A small donkey steam engine was hooked to a pump that was kept running 24 hours a day to keep the expanding hole clear of seeping groundwater. The work was difficult. The load of scrap rail iron carried on the cars had been wrapped around the wreckage like frozen spaghetti by the incredible force of the flood. Then salvage men began excavating. A small donkey steam engine was hooked to a pump that was kept running 24 hours a day to keep the expanding hole clear of seeping groundwater. The work was difficult. The load of scrap rail iron carried on the cars had been wrapped around the wreckage like frozen spaghetti by the incredible force of the flood. The Kansas Pacific official in charge of the salvage operation was H.N. Nicholson. He was tall and a bit of a dandy. A thick, carefully waxed mustache graced his handsome face. Sipping from a tin dipper of water, he brushed his mustache dry with the back of his hand. He turned to Johnny Schaefer, a local ranch hand hired to assist the railroad. August 1st, still no sign of the locomotive. Maybe when that air pump comes we can burrow down and strike her. Schaefer nodded in agreement and then smiled when he saw 12-year-old Molly approaching with lunch. Catherine Mack, called Molly by everyone in town, was followed closely by her pet deer as she walked the tracks east from Kiowa Crossing. Her arms were loaded with baskets and tin pails that contained sandwiches, pies, and cloth napkins. Her mother had been contracted by Nicholson to feed the salvage crew their noontime meal. After passing out the food to the men, Molly saved the last basket for Henry Nordlow, who was only a year older and was working the donkey engine during his summer vacation. Henry bashfully tipped his hat, and Molly spread a napkin on a fallen tree trunk. As he began to eat, she sat alongside and stared at the huge hole, which looked like a moon crater. "How's the progress today, Henry?" "We'll have that last car out of the ground by the end of the week. We dug up the coal tender, but we still can't find the engine. Mr. Nicholson is bringing in pumps to blow air down a pipe. He thinks that if he makes enough holes, one will hit the engine." Both children grew up, got married, grew old, and swore to their dying day that engine number 51 was never located and dug up. They passed on this account of the missing locomotive to their children. The probable theory at the time was that the engine was swept miles downstream and buried in quicksand so deep it could never be found, much less recovered. Over the next 100 years, newspapers and railroad journals still reported engine number 51 as missing. Haunting stories were told of a mysterious light, like the headlight of a locomotive, which crossed halfway over the new bridge at Kiowa Creek before suddenly blinking out. A few of the local ranchers swore they saw ghostly images of the crew wandering the creek bed.
You're probably asking, what does a train wreck on the flatlands of Colorado have to do with shipwrecks? Except for a comparable process. You're probably asking, what does a train wreck on the flatlands of Colorado have to do with shipwrecks? Except for a comparable process combining research with on-site investigation, absolutely nothing. Let's just say I had a soft spot in my heart for old engine number 51. I owed her a debt of gratitude. On May 21st, 1978, Elizabeth Sagstetter wrote an article for the Denver Post entitled "The Locomotive That Never Returned." It was the first time I learned of the tragedy. At the time, I was intrigued, not so much with launching a search for the elusive engine, but about working its disappearance into a concept for an adventure novel starring my hero, Dirk Pitt. 2 years later, the story of a train that was thought to have gone off a bridge over the Hudson River, but was later found sealed in an abandoned tunnel, was published in 1981 under the title Night Probe. Thanks to the lost locomotive of Kiowa Creek, Night Probe was one of my better plots. My son Dirk and I made the 60-mile drive from Denver to Kiowa Creek on a couple of occasions. We walked grids with the Schoenstatt gradiometer under and around the modern steel girder bridge built in 1935 that spans the creek over the exact spot as the one that was washed away in 1878. Except for a few small contacts, we turned up no reading that remotely suggested a large iron mass under the ground. The story of the lost locomotive languished in my Pneuma files for almost 10 years before my fascination with its disappearance surfaced again, and I decided to give it another try. In 1988, Craig Durgo had come aboard Pneuma and was working out of a small office in Arvada, Colorado. Craig, a fun guy who is built like a college football linebacker, also became caught up in the mystery and asked if he could pursue it. I gave Craig my blessing, but I was not optimistic. I thought it strange that during the 111 years since the old number 51 had vanished in the creek, give it another try. In 1988, Craig Durgo had come aboard Pneuma and was working out of a small office in Arvada, Colorado. Craig, a fun guy who is built like a college football linebacker, also became caught up in the mystery and asked if he could pursue it. I gave Craig my blessing, but I was not optimistic. I thought it strange that during the 111 years since the old number 51 had vanished in the creek, so few people had bothered to hunt for her. One was Denver grocery store owner Wolf Landiner. Shortly after the salvage crew threw in the towel that summer, Londoner heavily charged a crowbar with electricity and turned it into a magnet. After tramping up and down the creek bed, he hit a hot spot that violently agitated the crowbar before it plunged into the sand, dragging Londoner with it, all to the delight and astonishment of several onlookers. Londoner was pulled free, exhausted and soaked. He proclaimed that he had found the lost engine and demanded a reward. Colonel Fisher, representing the railroad's new owner, Jay Gould, turned him down cold. The only other recorded search was by Professor P.A. Rogers of the Geophysics Department of the Colorado School of Mines. In May of 1953, he and several of his students conducted a systematic search with military-type mine detectors. An area 150 by 400 feet was explored, with no results. Craig contacted Emma Mitchell, the director of a little museum in Strasburg, Colorado, only a few miles from Bennett and the Kiowa Creek Bridge. Emma mentioned she knew a brother and sister whose parents' systematic search with military-type mine detectors. An area 150 by 400 feet was explored, with no results. Craig contacted Emma Mitchell, the director of a little museum in Strasburg, Colorado, only a few miles from Bennett and the Kiowa Creek Bridge. Emma mentioned she knew a brother and sister whose parents witnessed the events after the bridge washout and asked if we would like to interview them. We immediately agreed, and a meeting was set up. When searching for something that is lost, it is always a good idea to spend time questioning the elderly who lived the events, or were much closer to the actual time than we are. More than once, a chance remark by an old-timer has put Pneuma on the right track to a discovery. Charles Nordlow, 92, and Henrietta Nordlow, 95, told the stories their mother and father had passed on to them in vivid detail. They both distinctly recollected their parents saying that although the crew searched the entire summer, no trace of the engine was found. At some point, the cost of the salvage operation must have exceeded the value of the battered locomotive, so the Kansas Pacific logically ceased work. It stood to reason engine number 51 was still buried in the creek. Driving back to Denver later in the afternoon, Craig looked pensive. A big iron mass like that should be detected by a good mag within one quickly ceased work. It stood to reason engine number 51 was still buried in the creek. Driving back to Denver later in the afternoon, Craig looked pensive. A big iron mass like that should be detected by a good mag within 1, maybe 2 hours. It's not near the bridge, I said. Trust me, Dirk and I have already eliminated the easy part. Then it should be a piece of cake to find it further downstream, he told me. I smiled. Then it should be a piece of cake to find it further downstream, he told me. I smiled. Cussler's search guide, rule number 22. If it was easy to find, someone would have got there first. The next step in locating the engine was to organize a more extensive search. Craig threw himself into the logistics and groundwork. By December, plans were finalized and the expedition began coming together. The director of the Colorado Historical Museum had offered to run a small blurb in their monthly journal to ask for volunteers. And Craig wrote a small one-column piece on the upcoming locomotive hunt and ended the article by saying, if anyone who owns a metal detector would like to come on out to Kiowa Creek, he or she would be welcome. This announcement was picked up by the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post newspapers. Then the local TV stations got in on the act. On the morning of the search, even with the mercury barely touching 10 degrees above zero, over 400 people converged onto the Kiowa Creek Bridge. Search fever had spread like an epidemic. One couple still stands out in my mind. A man and woman in their late 60s and obviously married stepped from their Mercedes-Benz sedan ready to dig. She was wearing a mink coat and hat. He wore an expensive cashmere topcoat with silk scarf and leather gloves. They were both carrying brand new shovels purchased only minutes before from the Bennett hardware store. Craig, along with several other rugged individuals, had erected a huge tent from the Air Force and had a generator with a heater operating and coffee brewing. Teams were formed by several diggers around whoever owned a magnetometer or metal detector. Craig had even arranged for a ham radio club to provide communications with each search team leader, who had a radio operator assigned to him. A remote camera was also set up that beamed images to the command tent so that Jim Grady and Marie Mayer, resident archaeologists, could view and identify any objects or artifacts dug up by the searchers. An inspired demonstration of efficiency, more than impressive enough to make the United States Special Forces green with envy. All that were missing were the dancers for the Hawaiian number. Craig assembled everyone by shouting through a bullhorn. Starting under the current bridge, I lined up the teams behind the people carrying the metal detectors, spacing the operators 10 feet apart, with me and the Schoenstatt gradiometer at the center. The idea was to sweep down the now dry stream bed, covering every square inch. I might as well have tried to herd cats. After walking about 20 paces, I turned and looked around. My little army had dissolved and scattered in every direction of the compass, each intent on following his or her own instincts. I particularly asked them to check out a sharp bend in the creek. It often happened I lined up the teams behind the people carrying the metal detectors, spacing the operators 10 feet apart, with me and the Schoenstatt gradiometer at the center. The idea was to sweep down the now dry stream bed, covering every square inch. I might as well have tried to herd cats. After walking about 20 paces, I turned and looked around. My little army had dissolved and scattered in every direction of the compass, each intent on following his or her own instincts. I particularly asked them to check out a sharp bend in the creek. It often happens that a large buried object will alter the natural flow of a river or stream. The bend ultimately proved to be a buried cottonwood tree. By early afternoon, several promising buried object will alter the natural flow of a river or stream. The bend ultimately proved to be a buried cottonwood tree. By early afternoon, several promising targets were located and exposed by a backhoe. Most were bits and pieces of debris from the wrecked cars and bridge. Craig called me aside and voiced his concern that we were not covering the grids properly. "I can't control them," he lamented. "Next time, Craig, we bring flamethrowers and incinerate anyone who doesn't search where he's told." "There must be a better way," he said. "I agree. Good flamethrowers are expensive." "No," Craig said, exasperated. "The teams need more instruction." "Look, my friend, the creek is barely 50 yards wide in most areas. As screwed up as the search has become, the entire creek from bank to bank and 3 miles downstream has been covered. Some of it 5 times because the teams keep crisscrossing each other's paths. I'm beginning to think the damn thing isn't here." I no sooner said it than a great cry went up in a field west of the creek and just north of the bridge. The Brower brothers, Mason Scott, had located a promising anomaly. Craig and I swept the gradiometer past the spot. The reading was good, but very concentrated. Not what I'd hoped, unless the locomotive was buried 30 feet deep. Don Boothby ran his ground-penetrating radar over and around the anomaly. In radar interpretation schools, they're now displaying the recording of the object we found to show students what an abandoned oil drilling pipe looks like. The image was picture perfect. At 4 o'clock, I brought everybody in and called it a day. I thanked everyone for a magnificent effort. They, in turn, applauded Craig and me for providing the opportunity to tackle something that gave them pleasure and that they could always talk about. Driving back through Denver to my house on Lookout Mountain in the evening gloom of that cold Sunday in January, I mentally sifted through all the data for any clue I might have missed. After dinner, I read and reread every paper in my research file, racked by my inadequacies in not solving the mystery. Perhaps, just perhaps, as I told Craig, the damn thing wasn't there. Bob Richardson, who runs the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado, maintained that the locomotive had been recovered. He cited an article published in 1953, stating the locomotive used that fateful evening was number 51, and that particular engine was listed as being rebuilt in 1881, with the number then changed to number 1026. I found problems with the article for a couple of reasons. One, no other source could be uncovered that supports the 1953 article's statements. And two, why did the railroad take nearly 3 years to put the locomotive back in service, when it could have, Golden, Colorado, maintained that the locomotive had been recovered? He cited an article published in 1953, stating the locomotive used that fateful evening was number 51, and that particular engine was listed as being rebuilt in 1881, with the number then changed to number 1026. I found problems with the article for a couple of reasons. One, no other source could be uncovered that supports the 1953 article's statements. And two, why did the railroad take nearly 3 years to put the locomotive back in service, when it could have just as easily been repaired and on track in a matter of a few months? I had all but given up finding an answer when, by a lucky coincidence, I was asked to do a radio interview while attending a conference of mystery writers in Omaha, Nebraska. During the phone-in part of the show, a caller inquired about Numa's search for the lost locomotive of Kiowa Creek. When asked the reason for his interest, he said he worked in the archives of the Union Pacific offices there in Omaha. I obtained his address and phone number, and we began to communicate. During his spare time, he dug through the old legal records of the Kansas Pacific from the time of the wreck until the company merged with the Union Pacific. After 3 months, he struck pay dirt. The story he ferreted out was one that is not uncommon in the present day and age. It seems that H.N. Nicholson, in charge of the original salvage operation, had indeed found the locomotive with probes sunk in the sand by his air pump. Without revealing his discovery to the salvage crew or local ranchers, he notified company officials in Kansas City. The now long-defunct Kansas Pacific Railroad immediately filed an insurance claim of $20,000 for the purported loss of the locomotive, and collected. A few weeks later, in the dead of night, a special train with Nicholson in charge arrived at Kiowa Creek. They dug up the locomotive, lifted it onto the track with a giant railroad crane, and towed it to the company maintenance shops in Kansas City. There it was rebuilt, its exterior appearance altered slightly. It was given a new number and put back into service. The operation went so smoothly that none of the ranchers in the area were ever aware of the recovery. Although we didn't find the engine, we did solve what appeared to be a 120-year-old insurance scam by a railroad that no longer exists. But did we solve it? Despite the records in the archives, there are many who refuse to believe the locomotive was found. The local ranchers insist it still lies buried beneath the sands of Kiowa Creek. It's whispered that around midnight, when no trains are due to pass, the plaintive wail of a steam whistle can be heard approach. The operation went so smoothly that none of the ranchers in the area were ever aware of the recovery. Although we didn't find the engine, we did solve what appeared to be a 120-year-old insurance scam by a railroad that no longer exists. But did we solve it? Despite the records in the archives, there are many who refuse to believe the locomotive was found. The local ranchers insist it still lies buried beneath the sands of Kiowa Creek. It's whispered that around midnight, when no trains are due to pass, the plaintive wail of a steam whistle can be heard approaching in the distance. Then comes the clank of a bell and the roar of steam exhaust. If conditions are just right, and there is a rain falling, a light is seen coming down the grade from the west toward the creek. Upon reaching the bridge, the beam suddenly blinks out, and the sounds of a locomotive melt into the night. As long as she is remembered, the spirit of old engine number 51 will never die. The lure of shipwrecks is a siren song. There are literally millions of sunken ships. I've often wondered how many ancient wrecks lie beneath the silt of the Nile River in Egypt. The Mediterranean is strewn with them.